Good morning and welcome to the 36th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2024. First item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is a consideration of the committee's approach to the Environmental Authorisation Scotland Amendment Regulation, quite a weighty tome. And the other item is item 4 is consideration of an evidence heard on the Land Reform Scotland Bill that we're about to hear. Are we agreed to take these in private? We are agreed. Our second item of business this morning is an evidence session on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. Today the committee will hear from a panel of commentators and researchers with an interest in land reform, and the focus today is mainly on part 1 of the bill. I'm pleased to welcome today Magnus Linklater, who's joining us online, who is a journalist, Laurie McFarlane, who is co-director of the think tank Future Economy Scotland, Peter Peacock, formerly an MSP and minister here, formerly the leader of the Highland Council and also a policy director at Community Land Scotland, and Andy Whiteman, formerly an MSP as well, and a researcher, I think you're more than a researcher, for Who Owns Scotland project. Thanks for accepting the invitation. I'm pleased to also welcome Rhoda Grant, who will have a chance to ask some questions at the end. As I've done in every session before I start this, I'd like to remind members that I have an interest in a family farming partnership in Moray, as set out in my register of interest. Specifically, I declare an interest in approximately 500 acres of farmland, of which 50 acres is woodland. I also declare that I'm a tenant of approximately 500 acres of Moray under a non-agricultural tenancy arrangement, and I have another farming tenancy under the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 1991, and I also take on grass lets occasionally annually. So we're going to move straight on into questions. My first question, which is a warming up question for all the panel members, is we seem to go through land reform bills every 10 years or so. Was this needed, and is it going to achieve what it set out to achieve? Let's start with Andy on that.
Right, we have a land reform bill every 10 years or so, but it's also worth reminding the committee, of course, that land reform is a very broad topic. So non-domestic rates, housing, rent controls, wildlife control, deer management, that's all land reform. And so, in fact, Parliament deals with quite a lot of land reform legislation, although it may not badge it as such. No, this bill won't achieve what it sets out to do, other than in the Part 2 provisions, which expressly make changes to the 1991 tenancy agreements for farmers and introduce a new tenancy regime, a refreshed tenancy regime for smallholders. Otherwise, depending on what, this is my main concern. The government appears to wish to introduce a bill that it has said will greatly empower communities and diversify land ownership. In fact, that's been the language that's been around for 25 years of devolution. But this bill will expressly not do that. Yeah.
Peter, I'm working along the table, so Magnus, I'll come to you last. So, Peter.
Okay. The short answer to your question is yes, it's needed. But no, it won't meet the objectives that are being set out for it. But I want to try and give that some context. You said this was a kind of warm-up question, so I'm going to limber up for a moment or two, if I can, with you.
Not on the whole bill, and not for the whole
I'm just
session.
going to try and put this into a context, if I can. And I want to go back, actually, to sort of just to lead up to devolution and the debates about land reform, and then quickly through devolution as well. That if you go back, I'm going to take you back to the Assembly referendum in '78, but the year following that, in 1979, John McEwen published a lifetime of work for him on Who Owns Scotland. And that's the first time that we've seen a kind of systematic appraisal of who did own Scotland. And it was a very dramatic moment in wakening up the country to the ownership patterns that exist in Scotland. And these are highly unusual to most people, but we're probably largely unaware of that in Scotland, but very unusual internationally. And we have more concentrated land ownership than is the norm in most places. And that was the first systematic look at that, and it highlighted these matters, and it then also revealed, in a sense, the economic and social consequences that flow from concentrated ownership, concentrated wealth, concentrated power, concentrated influence in very few hands, and a power imbalance, if you like, in society. society. Now, that's contested territory. People will contest that. But that was the kind of view that was emerging from that piece of work. There then followed in the 1990s, I guess, and Andy was part of this, the McEwan Lectures, a series of lectures leading up to devolution in 1999 from a number of professors and eminent people talking about the impact of the concentration of land ownership in Scotland on a whole variety of questions, economic questions, rural development questions and so on. Donald Dewar gave, I think, the last of those lectures in 1998 as the then Secretary of State and about to, as we now know, become the First Minister of Scotland. And he set out in that lecture one, his enthusiasm for land reform as being a great early opportunity for the Scottish Parliament. It would have the time to legislate for the first time, and it would have the inclination to legislate because the then Labour government, under his leadership in Scotland, was preparing some work on that. And he also, in a sense, alluded to the Parliament here not being subject to the will of the House of Lords, which many would have had maintained or helped maintain the current land ownership patterns that we had. And I guess in those years too, you had things happening like the Asant Crofters buyout, which was really inspirational. It inspired a lot of people in Scotland, grew a huge amount of interest, but quickly followed by the Egg land buyout, again inspiring people and driving people into debate about these things. Things like the Lagan community doing the first of the big forestry leasing schemes to try and get more local control. And over that last year before devolution started, there was the Land Policy Review Group that was underway, chaired by the then Rural Affairs Minister in the Scottish office. And if I can quote from that paper when it came out, if I can just quickly, that in the third sentence of the final document it said, and I quote, "We need to put in place new and innovative means to properly securing the public interest in land use and land ownership." And I stressed the question, the public interest in land use and land ownership. So that was right up front from the beginning. The first major recommendation they made to achieve that public interest, you had to increase diversity in the way land is owned and used, which will lead to less concentration of ownership and management in a limited number of hands. And of course, much land use is determined by ownership in the first instance. So that's a deep background. Come to this bill, and you've got the Scottish Government's policy memorandum stating the Scottish Government defines land reform as an ongoing process by which the ownership of land, its distribution, and the law which governs it is modified, etc. So, right at the heart of thinking over the 25-year period between different administrations is the concept of the public interest in land being important, and of concentration of land being an issue for Scotland that needed to be tackled. So 25 years of consistent policy towards that, and yet here we are 25 years later, and virtually nothing has changed in terms of the concentration and the patterns of ownership. And that, in a sense, is what this bill sets out to begin to take the next step on. One of the things Donald Dewar said in that lecture I mentioned was that he saw this as a long-term project. Land reform wasn't a single one-off event. It was going to be returned to by parliaments in the future until it made the kind of progress that it wanted to make. And this bill purports to deal with ownership, public interest and land use questions, but as it's drafted, it doesn't materially affect any of that, I would argue. And I can go into the detail of that when you want me to.
Okay. Laurie.
Great, thanks very much, Convener, and to the committee for inviting me today. I certainly do think that Scotland needs more land reform. As Peter's already pointed out, the Scottish Government's own definition of land reform is that it's an ongoing process, particularly focused on looking at the ownership of land, its distribution and the governance in terms of modifying, reforming and modernising it. And on this basis, I think it's clear we've still got some distance to go. Despite multiple rounds of land reform legislation in Scotland, which has seen some progress, many of the core issues that we have in Scotland remain stubbornly in place, whether that's in relation to the highly concentrated pattern of land ownership, which hasn't really shifted, indeed on some measures has potentially got worse over the past decade, whether it's in relation to the fact that Scotland's rural land market remains largely unregulated, where anyone can buy very large amounts of the country with few questions asked or consideration given to the public interest, or whether that's in relation to the fact that we've got an acute urban and rural housing crisis in Scotland, a large driver of which is a highly dysfunctional land market, or whether that's in relation to our ambition to deliver a just transition to net zero and meeting our climate, nature and biodiversity targets, again, all of which land is absolutely critical for. So does the bill meet the scale of the challenges? As currently drafted, I don't think it does. I think, for me, this is without doubt the weakest land reform bill that's been brought forward to this Parliament. There are some elements of the bill which I think are welcome, which we can get into around land management plans, deeper community engagement. I think some changes needed there, but certainly the right principles. But I do think that these measures really are tinkering around the edges and won't make a significant material change to the very core issues which I just outlined. And I would just echo what Peter said around public interest, because what's really been lost from this bill is any notion of the public interest. We did have the idea of a public interest test in the consultation, which I think had the seeds of being something that could be quite useful. That's been watered down completely and turned into this transfer and lotting mechanism, which was really only ever intended to be one potential outcome of a public interest test. And fundamentally, I think the issue, though, is that this bill has ended up being very narrow in scope, and there are just large things that are just completely missing. So there's very little, if nothing, on urban land reform or housing, for example, in relation to strengthening the land rights and responsibility statement or putting that on a statutory footings missing, around conditions to public funding for land-based activity. And I think the elephant in the room in land reform continues to be in relation to tax and fiscal policy, which I think has a really, really crucial role to play in all of this, which, of course, both this bill and I think the Scottish Government widely has been fairly silent on. So, as currently drafted, I'd see the bill as a bit of a missed opportunity. And if we look at the Scottish Government's core objectives, whether that's in relation to land reform itself or wider objectives like economic growth, tackling the housing crisis, delivering a just transition or building community wealth, I don't think the bill as currently drafted is going to materially advance any of these. Thank you.
Thanks. Magnus, now's your moment.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, we can hear you perfectly.
I'm delighted. I've only got two qualifications. One, as a journalist, I've been covering land reform since the beginning of time. I was sitting in the Parliament watching the first bill as it progressed in 2003. But I'm also to very much declare an interest. I'm a trustee of my wife's family estate in Perthshire, which is my late wife's family estate, which is 6,000 acres of heather and rock with a few sheep on it and a hydro scheme. And the question you ask is this bill needed? It depends what you mean. If the need is the political imperative of breaking up large acres of land and distributing it to local communities, then of course it's needed. That's always been the driving force behind land reform. But it runs into the barrier of what seems to me much more important, which is land use. And the point is that actually land use, in terms of delivering jobs and economic improvement, ironically, is very often better done by large estates rather than small broken up estates. And there is an inherent contradiction. You chair a thing called the Net Zero Committee, which is presumably aimed, with climate change in mind, at ensuring that the large areas of rural Scotland do their best with carbon capture and to help mitigate climate change. And right across Scotland, the message is the larger the areas of land, the better equipped they are to achieve this. The RSPB itself says nature does better in these larger, more ecologically joined up places. I'm looking at my copy of The Times, my own newspaper, this morning, and there's a group has been formed in the west of Western Highlands by 4 landowners to create a huge area of land because they think they can achieve rewilding. I'm not a great believer in rewilding myself, but, you know, everybody seems to subscribe to it. Scotland's largest landowner, Anders Poulsen, who gets very little criticism from this government, is a rewilder, as I understand it. And here we are, this local community group has been formed, includes Forestry and Land Scotland, which is a government agency, and the Woodland Trust Scotland, a nature conservation charity. We, on our Perthshire estate, have been encouraged by Nature Scot, RSPB, all the agencies we consult, to join up with other estates to achieve greater biodiversity and conservation. So it seems to me that right at the heart of this bill, there is an inherent contradiction. What are we trying to achieve in terms of land use? And if what we're trying to achieve is a balance between agriculture and conservation, then actually, ironically, bigger is best.
Thank you. Now, there are a whole heap of questions, and the first question was obviously a soft introductory question which allowed lengthy contributions, but we can't do that on every question. So I'm going to just encourage short questions, short answers, and see how we go. Mark, I think you're first.
Yeah, thanks very much, and found those contexts and introductory comments very useful. But can I ask you, what do you think is specifically missing from this bill? Andy, do you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, I've been arguing for land reform since 1993, and I've set out extensive things that the Scottish Parliament needs to do and has never done. My basic position is we need to get the fundamentals right. In the words of the current Labour administration, we need to fix the foundations. And that means getting the structural elements of ownership. That means proper fiscal policy. It means reforming inheritance law. It means a properly functioning, transparent market, and all the rest of it. So I believe in fixing, the fundamentals, and then I actually believe in allowing landowners as much freedom as possible within that. But land reform has been characterised in this Parliament as what I call tactical interventions, little tweaking around when people choose to sell things. And that's not achieved a great deal. So what's missing here is, as Laurie says, tax. There's a massive gaping hole. Inheritance law reform, common good, land. I mean, in fact, I drafted an outline land reform bill last December, and my blog is about 30 sections. They're all missing. But I mean, more specifically, in the government's own consultation, they talked about a public interest test. There's none. Strengthening the land rights and responsibility statement, not done. New conditions on those in receipt of public funding, not done. No new land use tenancy, not done. Restrictions on ownership to legal entities registered in the UK, not in the bill. No proposals on tax reform. So there's heaps of stuff that government that we all spent quite a considerable amount of time thinking about and responding to the government about, and then nothing's happened. And I think there's a process problem here. This is the 2001 land reform draft bill, what was called a white paper then, launched by Jim Wallace in your constituency, actually, in Aberfoyle. This is pre-legislative consultation, so half of this is policy stuff, and at the back you've got a draft bill on the right and explanatory notes on the left. And that meant that government could test its proposals, and you could politely say to government, look, this isn't going to work. Whereas you're finding us here saying this isn't going to work in the pressured environment of a parliamentary committee, which is inevitably taken by the government to be hostile. So this bill is poorly thought out, doesn't deliver many of the things the government asked us its views on, and I'd be happy to follow up with a list of 50 things this bill doesn't do, which it could do.
Yeah, that would be useful.
You could start with all the recommendations of the Land Reform Review Group, of which a tiny fraction have been delivered, and the ones that have been attempted to be delivered, a lot of them have been dropped. The million-acre target, gone. Complete the land register, never happened. Have a Scottish Land Information System by 2017, John Swinney announced it 2015, never happened. I mean, this is a record of government making grand statements about things it's going to do, and then not delivering.
Okay. Peter?
Well, I think if I look at this in two ways, if you look at what's in the bill, there are omissions from within it, if you like, and then there are omissions from the whole agenda. Looking at the bill itself, there's an omission of a public interest test, which was not just a political commitment of the governing party, but also of your party and of the Labour Party. It was warmly supported in the consultation the government themselves did, and it's mysteriously disappeared. And replaced with something which I don't think would stand up legally within the context of ECHR. So that's missing from within the bill. I think there's far too much left of regulation in the bill and not enough on the face of the bill to define things like the public interest and to define, for example, the enforcement proceedings for land management plans. Now, and I can go on, there's issues around lotting and so on and planning notification that you could strengthen the bill because there are things that I think omitted to it and too much left to regulation. And there's some quite relatively simple ways of strengthening the current bill for the important points that do exist within it. Points of principle are important. Beyond that, outside that, I guess the fact that urban Scotland is not included in the bill, I think that's a major and retrograde step. You know, that the original Land Reform Act in 2003 was, I think, if I remember correctly, was confined to communities under 10,000 population. That was widely seen in practice to be far too limiting in scope. And then in the Community Empowerment Act of 2015, as I recall, that was extended to all communities in Scotland so that every community enjoyed similar rights. We're now again dividing rural Scotland and only parts of rural Scotland from the rest of Scotland. That's a major retrograde step. And again, there are, I think, comparatively simple mechanisms that you could use to include that. I think the whole question of the regulation of the market in Scotland, the land market, is completely absent. From here, you're still in the position in Scotland today, and you would be after this passed. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. If your chequebook is big enough, you can come to Scotland and buy whatever land you want, and no questions whatever are asked. Now, we're pretty unique in a European context, and in fact internationally, in allowing that to happen. So at some point, we've got to get to the point of the public interest in land transactions being looked at. Now, there's part of this bill gives you a route into that, but we're not quite there yet. So there's the question of land market regulation. That might include also things like the valuation principles for compensation when land sales take place to the public bodies in the public interest. What are the compensation rules? And at the minute, we are paying vast fortunes to people who have been speculating sometimes on the land in the first place. And it's maybe time to start influencing that to a far greater extent. There's a whole question of taxation and tax incentives that require to be looked at in relation to land as well. And Laurie's much more expert on that than I am. But if you want to change behaviours, and the purpose, touching on what Magnus Linklater said, if the purpose is, and it has been consistently between political parties for 25 years, is to diversify ownership, to allow more economic opportunity for people across Scotland, to release enterprise and flair and goodwill across Scotland that you can get from much more diverse land ownership, help contribute to the development of community wealth, help contribute to a just transition to net zero. I mean, you can't have a net zero just transition if all the proceeds that are being pumped into the changes in the environment require end up in very few pockets in Scotland. There's nothing just about that, and that's a consequence of our land ownership patterns. So you have to get into these kind of taxation fiscal measures to be able to look at that. And again, I mean, I'm quite happy to add comments later, but those are the kind of things, if you want to broaden the agenda, but there's also omissions that you could deal with within the frame of the bill.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Laurie?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, similar to Peter, I would say, if we break it down in two different ways, one is what's missing in terms of what's the proposals in the bill, and then separately what's just missing from the bill entirely. So, as I said in my opening remarks, I think what's missing is any sort of notion of the public interest in the proposals. The consultation had this public interest test, which I think had, as I say, the seeds of something there, far from perfect. And I think it's important to point out that when it comes to land reform, the public interest is a very well understood and defined concept in law when it comes to property rights, both in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, Scots law, UK law. that's a very well understood term. Instead, under the transfer and lotting proposals, it appears to be based on this sort of ill-defined concept of community sustainability, which is a sort of a relatively not well-defined new term. And so I think in terms of the specific proposals in the bill, looking at moving away from that transfer and lotting proposal, which, at least in the consultation, was really intended to be one possible outcome of a wider public interest test, and we sort of chopped off the top bit and just left this second bit, which is, I think, potentially quite confusing. And in terms of other things that are missing, I mean, again, as I said in opening remarks, urban, definitely missing, but also land in relation to housing. I mean, I think particularly at the moment when we have such an acute housing crisis, both in urban and rural Scotland, I think recognising that the land market is a key part of that, and there are changes which I think could have been in here that would help that. We have, I think, somewhat confusingly, a number of other parallel things happening to this bill, including the review of community right to buy, which I think is sort of slightly strange that that's happening in parallel. We've also got a review of compulsory purchase rules in parallel, again, which I think is slightly confusing because it could have easily fed in here. Again, I already mentioned things around conditions for public funding. And as I say, the elephant in the room around tax, and whether that's in this bill specifically or somewhere else, I think that has to be front and centre of the debate around land reform in Scotland. And if we're not going to go there, I think that we're not going to be able to achieve the objectives that the Scottish Government set out for itself.
Yeah, thank you. Magnus, do you think the scope of the bill is correct, or do you think it's too broad?
The question is what is missing, I think. If the one thing I agree with both Peter and Laurie on is the definition of public interest, but I think I would approach it in a very different way. I would need to see how far the bill actually will succeed in improving, enhancing the public interest. And my definition of that is whether the land is better used to produce also a myriad of things, whether it's more housing, jobs, or ecologically balanced land use. I think that's completely missing from the bill, and there's no real test of whether community ownership really provides that. I mean, Peter says, we've had, this long period of community buyouts, but there's never been, to my knowledge, an audit of how much that has cost the state, what it has produced in terms of jobs, housing, etc., whether it's been economically valid move or not. And so what's missing from this bill is a test of whether land will be better used under this bill, more consistent with all the aims that everybody wants from rural Scotland, but which is very often difficult to produce on land which is unproductive. So at the heart of this bill is a presumption that it is good to proceed with greater distribution of land, but no real test of what that is going to achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Monica, you've got the next questions, and I think a follow-up on that one as well.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, thank you everyone for your contributions so far. Good morning. Given that building community wealth has been mentioned a couple of times, I think both by Laurie and Peter, just interested to hear what could be done with this bill, and given that, again, in parallel, the Scottish Government is committed to a separate bill on community wealth building, is enough being done to join up the Government's work in this area, or could we think about amendments at a later stage of the bill? I've mentioned Laurie and Peter, but if others have a view, happy to hear it. Peter, you've caught my eye first.
Regrettably, my leg of my specs has fallen off, convener, so I'm going to have to hold these to my head to see anything. But that's the perils of having to carry reading glasses all the time. On the community wealth stuff, I mean, I think that this is a really important concept that's developed in the last few years, and it's shared across the political parties. The idea that you can have communities that themselves are wealthy and not just individuals in them or around them that hold the wealth. And sharing that wealth, having an inclusive economy, these are all really important questions, and important questions of social justice ultimately, as well as economic justice. And the bill, as it's framed, doesn't really allude to this very much at all. And that's partly where I would pick up Laurie's point and emphasise that again, that within the bill, if we were to focus on the public interest, and to some extent it's Magnus Linklater's point too, and I'll happily send Magnus the excellent evaluations there are on the benefits of community ownership when I get the chance. But within the bill, you could start to use the phrase community wealth building as a function that ministers have to think about in making lotting decisions. Will the lotting decision do anything to enhance the likely development of community wealth? Question mark. And that would be a part of a public interest test. I think equally in the work of the Land and Communities Commissioner, as envisaged, who would be making recommendations to ministers potentially about potential lotting decisions, again, you can frame the way in which the Land and Communities Commissioner has to operate as a way in which their actions must seek to further community wealth building through their actions. I think the terms of reference for the Land Commission itself need to broaden. They are of their time, a decade ago, and the community wealth building wasn't part of our vocabulary at that stage, nor was a just transition to net zero. So again, you could change the terms of the Land Commission's responsibilities, that their work must be exercised in a way that furthers just transition, furthers community wealth building. So you can do it in that way. I think also in management planning, which we'll come on to, I'm sure, in more detail, that the concept of having a management plan, I think in principle is good. I think the bill is weak in the way that it does that. But again, you could make sure that in creating a management plan, that management plan needs to address the outcomes that are within the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, and that in turn needs to embrace the concept of things like community wealth building, just transition to net zero. So I can see technical ways in which you can include this in the bill with relative ease, provided you cast this in the frame of let's look at the public interest, and there are a number of dimensions to the public interest. That's completely still defined in the bill. I think the significant thing too about the public interest question and the use of the words is that the only way in which you can interfere with people's private property rights, which are protected under the European Convention of Human Rights under Article 1, Protocol 1, is if you are acting in the public interest. And that's why it's crucial that if you want to involve yourself in lotting, if you want to get into diversification of ownership, you are inevitably going to rub against ECHR. And in order to do that successfully, that's why things have to be defined in terms of what is the public interest here. And if Parliament take the care to legislate for that, and the Land Commission have done work and commissioned work from a KC to look at how you can do that, then you can achieve that. But that's the context in which I would put it. It is entirely possible to advance this in those sorts of ways.
Thank you, Peter. That's helpful. And Laurie, on community wealth building?
Yeah, so I think the Scottish Government is commendably committed to promoting community wealth building principles, and as you say, is committed to bringing forward an act. One of the 5 key pillars of community wealth building is in relation to land and property, and so I think it's absolutely right that we're talking about this. I think there's 2 things to mention. So firstly, as Peter said, principles of community wealth building are currently missing from here, but could be incorporated into various things in the bill as a key consideration. And by community wealth building, really talking about ensuring that, or promoting the creation and retention of wealth locally in communities, rather than having systems where wealth is often extracted from local communities, and that can include from systems of, for example, absentee land ownership. And so whether that's in relation to a consideration in the broader public interest, in a public interest test, or in land management plans, for example, there are also specific policy measures which are missing from here, which I think would absolutely support community wealth building, be that in the Land Reform Bill or the Community Wealth Building Act, one of which is compulsory sale orders, which is something that has been discussed for quite a while. The Scottish Land Commission has done a fairly large amount of work on this in bringing, for example, vacant and derelict land that has been sitting for a long time, idly and unproductive, back into use, potentially even into community ownership, promoting that community wealth building model. But again, we've got another bill here where that proposal is not here, and it's not really clear to me why.
Thank you, that's helpful. I've got questions on land management plans. Will I move on?
I think Kevin wants to come in with a follow-up on that particular one, so I'll bring him in and come back to you, Monica.
I appreciate it, Convener, and I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because you've already mentioned that there is mention of community sustainability in the bill, Also, Laurie, you said that there wasn't a perfect definition for that. I wonder if you would agree that maybe community wealth building could be added into community sustainability. Sustainability would include wealth building, in my view. Would you say that that is the case, and that maybe what is required here is some better definition of those terminologies? Peter
okay,
and Laurie, please.
Well, yeah, I think that I think community sustainability it appears in the policy memorandum, and it appears in relation to the questions of lotting in particular. But also, it's a new term, community sustainability. It doesn't really have any legal definition. Whereas if you had community sustainability, for example, as one dimension of a public interest test, where you've got a range of other considerations, that might be one way of handling it. But the way in which you can build community wealth building, and you can take a variety of technical routes into doing that, that could be one, as the way you've suggested. My own preference would be to see the public interest defined in a way which in aggregate becomes community sustainability. So it's got a housing dimension, it's got a biodiversity dimension, it's got an environmental access dimension, it's got a whole range of dimensions to it. But in the aggregate, that maybe you may argue that helps with community sustainability. But I think it's important to define community wealth as one of these clear attributes that you've got to have.
Laurie, please.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the community sustainability term. It is new and it is not very well defined in the memorandum, and so I think I would suggest the committee sort of looks into that a bit and tries to understand that a bit better. I agree with Peter that I think a better option would be to have this instead framed around the very well understood concept of the public interest, which is obviously very context specific in different places with different challenges. And I would suggest that community wealth building absolutely being part of that. As one of consideration among many in that wider public interest. I think the issue with community sustainability, at least as I'm interpreting it, is there are cases where, for example, the sort of sustainability of the community is not necessarily in question, but there might be a strong public interest justification. And so it seems to me that that community sustainability point is very narrowly focused on specific circumstances, for example. And so absolutely community wealth building, I think, should be ingrained much more into the detail of the bill. But I think, as I say alongside Peter, that should be in a sort of wider context and framed within the public interest, if that makes sense.
I don't know if Andy or Magnus want to come in, convener.
Andy. Well, these are just words.
Sorry, let's just get this right. I think Magnus was wanting in and Andy. So, Kevin, I think you've chosen Andy first, and then we'll go to Magnus.
These are just words, and I don't care what you call it. The actual mechanisms in Part 1 are not going to achieve anything. So you can put whatever words in you like. That's not going to change the fundamentals. I just want to pick up Monica Lennon's point about joined up, because this is one of the weaknesses of the process of land reform for a quarter of a century in this place, is that the Scottish Government, as I understand, has a subcommittee doing climate, and one of the responsibilities of the Climate Minister is to achieve cross-cutting policy across government, from the justice, through transport, through environment, through to health, social care and all the rest of it. That's never happened with land reform. So we had a non-domestic rate bill when I was in this Parliament, which the Land Reform Review Group made major recommendations on, which the Scottish Land Commission has made recommendations on, but that was never looked through the lens of land reform. So there's lots of bits of legislation in this Parliament that go through that are actually about land reform, and that they're not subject to any cross-cutting government policy, and that's been a major weakness. Now, if you talk about community wealth building, like I say, it's a word, but if you actually look at it historically, I was in the Borders recently, we've been building community wealth since the royal boroughs were established in the 10th century in Scotland. Now, if you look at the Borders, for example, Berwick has got about £3 or £4 million of assets and an annual income of over £500,000 from its assets. And that's more than all of the 8 Scottish Borders boroughs, Jedburgh, Hawick, Gala, Peebles, etc., combined. So actually the best way to build community wealth, I think, in Scotland is to become part of England. I mean, that's the experience of Berwick. It became part of England and has retained its wealth. This big Scottish Borders towns, boroughs, have lost all their wealth. So this is not a new thing. This is a really old thing. And I'm fed up with these new terms being bandied about as if the use of a word itself will somehow magically transform anything. Look at the substance of this bill. What are the outcomes it's intended to achieve, over what timescale, and will it achieve them, and how it's going to be audited?
Of having ex-politicians in, they will expand the answer to the question to fill the time. So, and I think, Andy, I read your article rightly on Royal Boroughs and the community wealth. Most of it had been sold off from the community, so the wealth didn't stay in it. So you can't blame anyone for that, apart from perhaps the communities that had it. Magnus, do you want to come in?
Well, I never thought I'd agree with Andy Whiteman, but I endorse pretty well everything he says. So I think I'm going to quote him at some stage. The best thing Scotland could do is join up with England. But I may use that in a column, Andy, at one of these stages. But if this is about wealth distribution, then that's a different ballgame altogether. I mean, the easiest way to do that is take any single estate that has a wind farm on it, lot it. The community will want to take that bit of the land that has a wind farm on it and has no interest in the rest of it. Just to give a little personal perspective on it, we have a hydro scheme. Now, that hydro scheme runs from the very top of the hill right down to the bottom. If that estate was allotted, one bit would contain the turbine, the other would contain all the water that makes the turbine work. The only way that that bit of land can produce wealth for the community is if the whole estate stays together. Another irony, another contradiction in this bill, and it brings me back to this essential test as to, what is going to benefit if the community is to have the opportunity to create wealth. Actually, it's not going to benefit particularly from chopping it up. Every estate is different, there will be different aspects. But inherent in this bill is the presumption that by dividing up and lotting an estate, you will be able to distribute wealth to that local community. It just doesn't work like that.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Monica now for the rest of her question.
Thank you. So we know that the bill includes provisions for land management plans. Have been mentioned this morning already, and they're required to set out how the land is being managed in a way that contributes to achieving net zero, adapting to climate change, increasing or sustaining biodiversity. Keen to understand from our witnesses if this level of detail is sufficient, or should there be other criteria included? And I might come to Andy first on that, if that's okay.
Well, I mean, I think this is the only part of part one that's worth pursuing, actually, because it brings a little bit more transparency in terms of making owners accountable for what they are planning to do with very, very large areas of land. I mean, we can talk about the threshold, but that's a detail. The threshold's far, far too high. I mean, I would set the threshold at 100 hectares and have exemptions for whole farm plans that exist, long-term forest management plans that exist, and all the rest of it, and just catch those by default. But the key thing about these plans is if they're to be, like I say, there's community engagement built in, there's going to be some transparency, they're going to be public. That's all terribly helpful, and that's not there at the moment, and that will be helpful. That is a step forward. But if you're going to do this seriously, and if it's going to be focused on achieving net zero, and it's about accountability, what these plans need to commit to and describe is how land's going to be managed in a way that achieves public policy objectives around climate and net zero. And those are objectives which, generally speaking, are met over a 20, 30, 40, 50-year time frame, as are, for example, long-term forest management plans, which are 25, 30, 40 years. So that's what they need to be. And the second thing is they need to be binding on successors. There's no point in just having a 5-year plan, then someone comes and buys it and does another 5-year plan. And I mean, this is the thing that really, really frustrates me. If you're going to do something, do it properly. Because, I mean, the community right to buy has achieved 0.25% of Scotland has transferred ownership. This was something that back in 1999 the government said would achieve a rapid change in the pattern of land ownership in Scotland. Just do this properly. And if you're not going to do it properly, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't mess around with, you know, little mechanisms here and little duties here that are purely performative, in my view, and are not going to achieve significant change. But that is the one bit of the part 1 of the bill that could be significantly strengthened along the lines I've suggested.
Peter?
Yeah, I agree there's something in management plans. I think that they are about, you know, when I went back to the Land Reform Policy Group work in 1999, it talked about land ownership on the one hand and land use on the other hand. Management plans are essentially about land use, and they're not about land ownership or diversification of ownership, and they're not a substitute for diversification of ownership, but there's something in them. And your point is essentially, I think, about, so what are the public interest considerations that need to be taken into account when developing a management plan, and is it currently sufficient? The bill itself, as drafted, says nothing about this. This is going to be left to, the details are going to be left to regulation. The policy memorandum alludes to the points that you've touched on. That's not in the bill. And I think there's a risk by leaving it open to the regulations as to what that will achieve. And I would hope the committee would be either looking for amendments from the government at stage 2 to you know, make these points explicit on the face of the bill, or asking to see the draft regulations so that you were satisfied that they were going to cover these points. My feel for this is that the land management plans need to be designed to meet the responsibilities of landowners to the public interest, and that should be defined in the terms that you've talked about. I would add that you can find ways of encapsulating that by talking about economic, social and cultural rights, which are established human rights, and these are already mentioned in some land reform legislation, so you're not breaking new ground. I would include community wealth building, just transition to net zero. I think explicitly talk about biodiversity is going to be very important, given our climate challenges. I think you can reference, you know, management plans should address how the housing supply locally will be, land for housing will be improved, how it will permit repopulation of land, and so on. These are just illustrative. I think it's quite relatively simple to define these things. At the minute, they are not defined at all, and I would strongly encourage the committee to look at that and to encourage the government to look at that in much more detail. And there's plenty of precedent in other bits of legislation that one can draw on to help define what would be the public interest considerations that a management plan is designed to address.
Thank you. And Laurie?
Yeah, I'm definitely supportive of the principle of requiring large landowners to prepare and consult on land management plans. I think there's a couple of issues. One, which has already been touched on, I think Andy mentioned, is in relation to the threshold. Obviously, to some extent, any threshold is somewhat arbitrary. We've got the situation at the moment where the thresholds for land management plans and the sort of transfer and lotting stuff are different, which I'm not sure makes a great deal of sense. I think both are too high, and I think there's scope to bring that down quite a bit. You would hope that most landowners covered here are producing some sort of plan anyway, and so I think the opportunity to provide more transparency and consistency along that is certainly welcome. There's also issues around, in terms of breaches, and the questions around the penalties that are set out in the bill, and whether that is much of an incentive, as it's at least for some a relatively small amount of money. As to the sort of scope of that, I would sort of echo both what Peter and Andy said. One, in terms of the scope, I think it's welcome that it's focused on climate and nature biodiversity, but I do think broadening that out a little bit and framing it around a sort of wider public interest, because bearing in mind each site will be very different, and I think having a sort of broader concept of the public interest, which yes should cover climate, nature, net zero stuff as well, but also broader issues. I mean, Peter mentioned housing, community wealth building, etc. It's all going to be site specific, but I think there's a way of providing landowners the opportunity to set out how their plans are going to deliver those long-term objectives in that sense. So yeah, I think sort of thresholds breaches that scope of what the plans are seeking to achieve. And I think Andy's point as well, which is around accountability over the delivery of them, is really important, because at the end of the day, if we're just setting out plans and then nothing happens, and maybe land changes hands, there's more plans, nothing happens, I think we need to make sure that they're actually they're in place and there's mechanisms of accountability over that to make sure that there's some kind of process for ensuring that it's happening and it's not just sort of nice words.
Thank you. And keen to hear from Magnus on this. We've heard previously that larger estates tend to do land management plans anyway. What's your view on the provisions in the bill around net zero, nature and climate? Should that be included? And do you agree that perhaps we need more detail at this stage?
Well, I think the elephant in the room here is what the Scottish Government's agricultural policy is going to be, because really we don't know what the balance is between production on the one hand, increasing food production, and encouraging biodiversity and nature conservation. Most estate or farm owners that I know are already well advanced in this. For instance, forestry has been hugely encouraged by the Scottish Government. It's an ambition of theirs to see much more planting, and a large number of farms in the borders have gone over to tree planting rather than farming. Not necessarily a good thing in my view, but most people are planning ahead in terms of all sorts of things. Peatland restoration on the one hand, wetlands, tree planting for carbon capture. These are a thing called natural capital, which is quite an amorphous idea, but it's a kind of balance of biodiversity, which everybody is getting very excited by. So there's a lot of work has been gone into already. But as Andy says, of their nature, these are long-term. You can't have a peatland restoration scheme that is a sort of 2 or 3 year thing. It's a 20 to 30 year thing. So that if on the one hand, landowners are being encouraged to explore conservation and biodiversity and invest in it, they are being scrutinised by every single agency, from SEPA to Nature Scot and all sorts of others. There is internal transparency, if you like, in the way that those plans are being pursued. But nobody's going to invest in that kind of thing if they are confronted with the prospect of selling off the land, lotting it at some future stage. In a way, there's a parallel here between the protests of farmers who are protesting against inheritance tax, because they see the long-term management of land as essential to everything they do. And the same thing does apply to people owning land in Scotland.
Monica, there's lots of follow-ups. So if you want to stay on this subject, if not, I'm tempted to bring in other committee members.
I was going to come on and ask about the role of community consultation in all of this, but if you want to bring in... No,
do community consultation, okay. Then I'll bring the other members.
Well, perhaps, maybe just some brief responses. So if the land management plans make it into the bill, how do we ensure that consultation with communities is meaningful? What should that look like, and how do we manage public expectation around that? Andy, you've looked at me first.
Communities are consulted to death.
Before you answer that, I mean, I'm interested just on that particular point, is because you have experience, I think, on forestry and how the community consultation with forestry plans go. It'd be helpful if you could explain the differences that you see between the two, or the similarities as part of that.
Well, with respect, Convener, I'm not proposing to get into the detail of that. I mean, I was wanting to respond in general terms. There are new duties here. I think it is virtually impossible in many, many parts of Scotland to expect communities to be meaningfully engaged in the drafting of management plans by the owners of large estates. Just very, very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but some of the relationships that exist there are really difficult relationships. Some of the motivations are hidden, and communities are consulted to death. I mean, I was just speaking to someone who trying to do a local police plan and stuff, and then they're being consulted on planning stuff and all the rest of it. Communities really have very little capacity to do this stuff. They're doing it in their spare time, they're doing it in a voluntary capacity, and they'll be sitting in a room with a land agent who'll be being paid £50 an hour or whatever. So I think it's really problematic. I think you need to make sure that it's as powerful as it can be, but I'm basically just saying I don't have any great hopes that it's going to be a particularly meaningful exercise, mainly because of the power dynamics at play. I mean, a community being engaged and consulted on a public body's plans, on a local plan for a planning authority, on a forest plan or proposal from Scottish Forestry or whatever, is a different beast than being consulted by the owner of the estate you live on. You know, it's just going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Andy's right in the sense that communities get consulted about a huge amount, and it does take an awful lot of effort. That's not a reason for not doing it, on the other hand. And so I'm kind of in sympathy with your question in the sense that if it's going to happen, it has to happen effectively. Now, I guess that in the bill, one of the ways to do this would be to say that in looking at management plans and how they are sort of signed off, if you like, then maybe the Land Commission should be issuing guidance around management plans, because the Land Commission have got responsibilities for the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement and its implementation. So you could find a way where government guidance could be given. There is existing government guidance on how to do effective consultation, which is, as I understand it, reasonably good stuff. And there's loads of experience out there about how to do that. So I'm sure it can be done, provided the imperatives are there within the bill, that when issuing guidance about the development of management plans, part of that has to be about how you're going to engage in that. However, more important than that, I think, is that communities will get very hacked off if they're consulted on a management plan and then the management plan sits on a shelf and nothing happens about it. And the weakness of the bill, as drafted, is not the principle of a management plan, it's how do you make sure something actually happens. Because you can go through the drafting of the plan and there are quite minimal requirements in terms of a fine if they don't actually develop a plan. I think the fine level is pretty low. I would like to look at things like cross-compliance. If you don't produce a plan, you don't get your other subsidies until you do. I would be quite tough on that. I would give the Land and Communities Commissioner a power to issue an order to produce a plan if somebody's not doing it, and if they fail to do so, that would be an offence. If you're going to take this seriously, really take it seriously. So that's in the creation of the plan. At the moment, you can create the plan, fulfil all the terms of the bill, and do absolutely nothing about it, and then nothing happens. There's no consequence from that, and that's a major weakness, and that's where communities got really hacked off if nothing happened. And again, I think it's possible to build in ways in which you can deal with that. You could create a requirement for the plan to be registered in some way with the Land Commission to give it some status. If the Land Commission saw that the plan did not comply with the guidance they had issued, they could refuse to register it until it did. That's a power in that. But once registered, so to speak, if that were the procedure, then there has to be an ability to monitor that by the Land and Communities Commissioner. And if they could monitor that, there has to be open representation from communities and others who've got concerns about the implementation. And again, you can ratchet up powers to make it clear that this is a serious business. If you own a lot of land in Scotland, one of the responsibilities that comes with that is that you must have a management plan that it takes account of the public interest. And we're serious about it as a set of institutions, Parliament and Government, but you're going to have to put those enforcement mechanisms in the bill. And I don't think that's complicated or difficult to do.
Thank you, Peter. So we've heard some challenges around implementation of a plan and what happens if it's not properly acted upon, but there's clearly barriers at the front end of this that Andy's touched on in terms of some of the power dynamics, and if communities don't have the time, the resource and the know-how. So maybe very briefly, Laura, if you could maybe touch on that, because Peter mentioned perhaps more guidance will be required for communities, but going back to that community wealth building, how do we resource communities to be actively engaged in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the sort of immediate and then the sort of more medium long-term stuff. I mean, in the immediate term, it is very difficult. Communities are time-constrained, busy, occupied with lots of other forms of engagement and things like that as well. And in the context that we're in, where we do have this highly concentrated pattern of land ownership, you have some difficult power dynamics, it is going to be challenging. And for me, any form of community engagement with a very large landowner is always going to be a poor substitute for direct community involvement, having a stake and say over decision making over the land that they live on. And so I think in the immediate sense, you know, is there ways that we can, whether it's for the Land Commission in terms of guidance or support, perhaps there are ways that we can try and ensure that there is meaningful participation and enforcement. But I think that for me, this should be, this sort of highlights in many ways one of the issues why we do need more fundamental land reform is because of these precise issues. And so, and a community wealth building approach, it's more about trying to have a situation where communities are more actively engaged in a stake and say over the actual ownership and use of the land itself. And clearly, in many cases at the moment, that's not possible. We've obviously got things like community right to buy, etc. But there are many, many barriers to that at the moment, not least of which is just the funding and the resources to be able to do that, far less actually engage on a land management plan. And so, yeah, I think there are probably some things that Peter and Andy have outlined which could be done to help this, but I think it is going to be difficult, and I don't think in the immediate sense there's a sort of silver bullet solution here necessarily to make sure that you get meaningful community engagement which is then acted upon and then delivered.
Do you want to come in on that? Thanks. I was asking if Magnus wanted to come in on that.
Yes,
he's the
yes,
only
I do.
panellist that hadn't been given the opportunity.
Because Peter raises a really important point about the powers of the Land Commissioner. When I was researching this bill, I talked to a couple of lawyers, and they described the powers conferred on the Commissioner under the terms of the bill as unprecedented, not only in Scotland, but the United Kingdom. And where a community itself doesn't have the resources to maybe put together a bid or decide how best to use the land, the Commissioner, as I understand it, will have a huge role in stepping in, particularly when it comes to lotting. He will be the person who decides, down to, as I understand it, which members of the family are entitled to succeed as an estate is lotted up. So far from building up the powers of that commission, Peter, I would suggest that it needs to be very, very closely looked at to see how accountable and transparent the Land Commissioner him or herself is going to be, because they will have enormous powers.
And no, in fairness, Peter, we're coming back to the Land Commissioner at some questions at the end. So you will get a chance, but I'm just going to make the observation, Peter and Andy and Laurie, Magnus, is that we are on question about, well, I think it's fair to say we're an eighth of the way through the questions and we're an hour through of our time. Now, there is always a danger of having politicians on panel, ex-politicians, that they may expand the answers. I am going to ask you to cut them down, and I will carefully signal you to try and keep your answers short. And it's all very well just nodding at me, but you will have to pay a bit of time to me, because if I don't get all these guys' questions in, I'll be in trouble at the end of it, and I have to live with them on a daily basis. So please keep your answers short. And of course, there's no problem with saying I agree if you do agree with another panel member and leaving it at that. So I'm going to go to the other questions on this. First of all, I've got Michael, then Mark, and then Kevin, and then back to you, Monica, for your next ones.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I want to stick with the land management plans. And Andy, you made reference to the fact that very often a lot of key aspects of land management are long-term plans. It's a 5-year period that's set out or intended by the government for a land management plan. Do you think that's too short a period? And if you do think it's too short a period, do you think it should be for a longer period of time, which would make more sense in being able to implement the proposals within a land management plan?
Yes.
And what sort of time frame do you think would be more suitable?
Well, I mean, most management plans have a variety of timescales. So a long-term forest management plan is 40 or 50 years, but within that you have 5 and 10 years. So it's not about a fixed term, it's about how far you're looking ahead, and you've got to look reasonable distance ahead, I would say 50, 60 years, but then you have steps in between. So that's how it should be looked at. This is not difficult. It's already done with long-term forest management plans.
Peter?
No, similarly, I think it's less important that it's a short 5 years or 10 years. I mean, I can see the arguments for long term. To me, the important thing is it's monitored, so that, you know, and it can be flexible and it can be adapted through the monitoring process apart from anything else. You don't have to rigidly stick to every letter because circumstances change, a whole variety of things change in the environment. So I'm less worried about whether it's a 10-year plan or a 15 or 20-year plan than I am to have the proper monitoring of that, whatever the length of time.
Okay, so implementation is clearly a key part of the effectiveness of any land management plan process, and also its credibility and whether there's value in it. On that point then, if, for example, a piece of land was to change hands after a land management plan had been put in place, do you think that the new owner should inherit the intentions that were set out in the original land management plan at that point? Andy?
Yes, of course. It's up to the government what it was trying to do with this bill, but what the government said in its consultation was land reform in a net zero Scotland. Okay? A major part of this bill is intended to be delivering net zero in relationship to the contribution that land can make. And that's a long-term business. In fact, there was a recent paper in Nature saying that all this carbon offsetting by trees and all the rest of it needs to be the same as the geological timescales of the fossil fuels we're burning. In other words, we need to be able to guarantee that these offsets are going to work for like 1,000 years. So that's what the science is saying. So of course they've got to be binding. And the way to make that binding is to make the plans registrable. I mean, I just dug out the old forest dedication scheme. I mean, this was introduced, I think, in 1952. I can pass the committee all the literature on it. You'll see these regularly in titles of Scottish estates. They enter a dedication scheme, and clause 1 says that the owner, which expression includes where the context so admits, require his successors in title. Right, so the plan is binding for as long as the plan exists, and these plans often exist for 50 or 60 years, you shall use that land for forestry. The detail could be changed by a new owner. They can come in and they can have a slightly different plan of operations. They can decide to slightly change their objectives. All of that can be changed by the new owner. You know, you shouldn't bind a new owner to detail, right? But if you're going to have a plan that's long-term, delivering net zero, the basics of that plan should be binding on successors, and the way you do that is make it registrable against the title, and that's what forest dedication agreements were. We've done this before. We did it in the 50s under a Conservative government. I don't see why there's any difficulty in doing it now.
Peter?
Yeah, I think this is really complex territory you're into here, because I mean, I can see an argument in the face of it that if somebody buys an asset, that they should have the right to determine what they do with that asset. On the other hand, as Andy said, if this is about the public interest in land, and the land management plan has been created in the public interest and agreed in the public interest, then you'd have to have a strong case for changing it. And so I'm attracted to what Andy says in those regards. I'm also thinking, however, of land that's currently very badly managed. And the land management plan may, I mean, I can think of Glenfeshie, for example, a great historic example, which you will know from walking there, I'm quite sure, that you know, go back 30 years when I used to walk there, it was a devastated landscape, overgrazed by deer and managed as a shooting estate. Along came Anders Paulsen, very controversially in some eyes, and has utterly transformed that estate in the course of that 30 years through natural regeneration. So you wouldn't have wanted the old management plan if it was about keeping that estate in the old way to continue. You'd want it in the new way. So there's a bit of complexity there that one has to think about. That comes back to the public interest, that, you know, when you're agreeing a plan is in the pursuit of the public interest, then these matters have to be considered. And if there is an extant management plan out with the Glenfeshie circumstances, then you don't buy the land if you don't agree with what it's going to be used for, if that has been agreed in the public interest. I think the other thing, though, that your question highlights, which I think is a major omission in this whole agenda of land reform, is that the current bill has moved away from the original concept of the Land Commission to focusing on the land sale and not the land purchaser. And to me, there ought to be a look at who's purchasing the land and what their plans for the land are. And that's really important. Now, arguably, if you had a good land management planning system that was operating in the public interest, that concern fades away somewhat, because you'd have plans that, by definition, had been agreed to be in the public interest, and therefore the new purchaser would have to go along with that, or wouldn't purchase. But it highlights the point that we are not looking here at a purchaser of land and what their intentions for that land are. And as matters stand, anybody can come in, buy any land and do what they want with it, basically.
Why do you think the focus is on the seller rather than the purchaser?
I'm perplexed. I don't actually know. I mean, I've always thought that having, well, I mean, I'm probably more radical on this than a lot of people. Perhaps, I don't know. Personally, I would go for a presumption in Scotland that you cannot buy more than 500 hectares of land unless you can demonstrate it's in the public interest. Now, you can argue about why. Whether the 500 threshold is the right threshold. That's quite high. 500 hectares is a lot of land in Scotland, in my book. So I would tackle this from the other end and have some sort of presumption against owning more than 500 unless you could show it was in the public interest, and that would take care of it. I simply don't know why the government did not go for this. I think that there's other. I mean, if you're a potential purchaser, you don't enjoy your existing property rights, so you're not rubbing against ECHR in quite the same way. But I think you need to pursue the government on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay. Magnus, can I ask you about the issue around land management plans and the idea of the 5-year period, whether it should be longer term, or also on the issue of whether the content of a land management plan should be, by and large, inherited by any new owner of land?
Yes, just very quickly. I mean, I just in passing find it ironical that Peter is commending the work of Anders Poulsen, who is now the largest landowner in Scotland. And he's able to do all that, of course, because he brings great wealth from outside and invests it in regeneration. It actually, for those people who don't have that wealth, there's another aspect in terms of long-term planning. Because if you are going to introduce a peatland restoration scheme, a forest planting scheme, a hydro scheme, you've got to borrow money. And it's a long-term borrowing. It's 15, it's 20 years if you're borrowing money from the bank. So that is another consideration in terms of planning, the fact that you get exposed to big loans from the banks in order to achieve the regeneration or the biodiversity or whatever it is.
So I'm taking, Magnus, from your comments that you would favour a land management plan that is longer term.
Yes.
Is that correct? And do you think that the conditions set out in a land management plan should be inherited by anyone who becomes a new owner of that land after the plan's been agreed?
I agree with Andy on this, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
The next question comes from Mark.
Yeah, I was interested in asking you about the linkage between local place plans in the planning system, public consultation process, and land management plans, which, as you've said, Andy, already will effectively be controlled and steered by private interests with land agents involved in that. How do we get the two to work together, should they work together? And I would raise the example of Taymouth Castle, where you have an estate which currently wouldn't even fall within the land management plan provisions, but there's a concern within parts of the community around Kenmore and Aberfeldy that that estate has effectively aggregated a whole range of assets, some of which are urban, some of which are on part of the wider estate, but there's a lack of transparency about what the long-term plan is for both housing, land management over time. So there's a kind of mix of different issues, some of which are contained in a land management plan, potentially, if they were eligible for that, some of which are in the local place plan. I'm just interested in how you, from the community perspective, how do you get two things to join up? Andy?
Well, you can't get them to join up because the local place plan is part of the town and country planning system, and in 1947 rural land was left out of the town and country planning system. So the kinds of issues that the management plans in this bill are designed to address are issues that are out with the planning process. So if you want to bring that in the planning process, I would welcome that. I don't think we should ever have been left out in 1947, but it is out. So I really don't think you can try to join these two very, very different systems. One is a compulsory land management plan, which, you know, is got to be published, and there's no implementation obligations or monitoring or anything. But that in the first hand, which is designed principally to achieve a little bit more transparency, as I said earlier, and a local place plan, which is a voluntary thing and part of the planning process, not part of the local plan, etc., but is part of the democratic local planning system. And many of the issues that are raised in Taymouth Castle are really issues to do with the effectiveness of the local planning system. That's what it is. So I wouldn't link them unless you want to bring rural land use into the planning system. I would welcome that.
Yeah. To be candid, Mr. Ruskell, I haven't thought about that at all. So I'm thinking this on my feet. I mean, the only thing that immediately occurs to me, I think it's immensely complicated for the reasons Andy said, but it seems to me that in guidance that was issued about the creation of land management plans by the Land Commission, it would be entirely possible to say that the land management plan must have regard to a local place plan in its creation, so that at least you're creating a connection between the consideration of a land management plan and the local place plan that either is in development or has been created. But that would be a relatively simple mechanism to draft in, but I haven't really thought beyond that.
Yeah, Laurie?
I don't really have much to add to that, to be honest, other than just to say, as Andy said, rural land is out with the planning system, and so the bigger picture, I suppose, is should there be the ambition to bring that into the planning system at some point, and is land management plans a sort of a less good substitute from that? But I think that's obviously a bigger, longer term thing.
Magnus?
I think the one thing I'd just like to raise, interesting, Mark, that you raise Taymouth Castle being hugely controversial, of course, with an American owner ploughing millions into it. It raises the question of what is the community and how does the community have a voice. Part of the community is dead against it because they see it just on principle. Here is somebody, you know, turning a place into a leisure park, which they don't want. The other part of the community sees jobs, sees the hotel being restored in a way that hasn't been restored for the last 50 years, welcomes the injection of funds. It becomes really a tussle between almost principle and ideology on the one hand and effective ownership on the other. So although, as Andy rightly says, this comes within planning laws rather than what we're talking about, it does raise the interesting question of the voice that the community has. And it's also interesting that the local MSP, who happens to be the First Minister, backs the plan.
I think in that case, I recognise that there are different views within the community, but perhaps what unites them is the need for transparency. And at the moment, there isn't a clear vision of what a long-term management plan for the village and for the estate in Glenlyon will actually look like. So do you acknowledge that it would actually benefit both sides of that debate to actually understand what it is that this estate is going to achieve in 30, 40, 50 years' time?
I think there's been quite a lot of transparency, actually. Certainly in the local media, everybody talks about nothing else, and they have very, very strong views both ways about it.
Okay.
Before we go on, can I just, and I've got Kevin next, just so I understand,
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So my question was that some of the consultation that we've undertaken as a committee and some of the visits we've undertaken have become down to very much local issues around settlements regarding housing and what communities want around there as far as amenities are concerned. And I was quite taken by I think, Andy, your map that you submitted as part of the areas where there's big land ownership and where there is lesser land ownership. So I'm struggling to understand the importance. Well, I think local place plans are important because it's what's going to drive the community forward, and it's how landowners can respond to the local community needs. I'm just trying to understand why I've got that wrong. Have I got that wrong?
Have you got what wrong?
What?
What have you got wrong?
Well, the local place plans are fundamental as far as management plans are concerned. So if the community say they want to build additional houses next to their village, that should be included within the management plan.
Okay,
and maybe the management plan of what happens upstream, 10 miles away, is not really that relevant.
Okay, I was taking a rather literal response to Mr. Ruskell's question, actually, about, management plans are not in the planning system, local police plans are. You could make that linkage in the sense to having regard to them and all the rest of it, but the first thing you've got to do is recognise the fact, I tried to do this analysis, but my technical skills were not quite there in the time I had available, that the map I showed you, I think, demonstrates that probably less than 10% of Scotland's population lives within, say, 5 kilometres of an estate that's going to be within scope of any of this. So, in fact, the overwhelming needs and desires and aspirations of people who live in small settlements and villages and towns in Scotland will be, this bill does absolutely nothing for them. And if anything demonstrates the need to bring this threshold down, that does. So and it illustrates the arbitrary nature of the threshold. If you have a look,
so what should the threshold be, Andy?
I'm not going to pluck a figure out of thin air. I think this is the problem. The rationale for the government's figure, the 1,000 hectares, in the consultation, as far as I can see,
well, 3,000 acres for the management.
No, I know, 3,000 hectares for the management, 1,000 hectares. The only rationale I could see was actually for the 1,000 hectares one, which was to leave out most family farms. And I thought, well, what about family estates? Or what about family forests? What is it about families? It's completely arbitrary. So if you want to do this, I would agree that every owner over, as I say, 100 hectares, I did mention that figure earlier, unless you've got a whole farm management plan, or you've got a nature reserve agreement or long-term forest management plan, should have a plan for what they're going to do with their land holding. And that should have regard, not to the local place plan, which in many cases won't exist, but to the local plan. Okay, so if it is agreed that Killin or wherever needs more housing, then really that should be something that is reflected in the management plan.
So I'm trying to work out, you're not prepared to give a figure on what it should be for the management plan. Does anyone want to offer?
Well, no, I did say 100 hectares.
100 hectares. And sorry,
with exemptions.
Sorry?
With exemptions for whole farm management plans or long-term forest management.
So 100 hectares, and I think in fairness you were quoting £50 an hour for a land agent. That's what it was 20 years ago when I was working. I think you'll find it's more than 4 times that an hour now. Well, it probably keeps pace with the mechanic in the garage who's probably charging £140 an hour. Peter, do you have a figure on
thresholds? I think there's a tension here between simplicity of understanding the legislation in the round and having different thresholds for different purposes. I don't think is very clever. I think 3,000 for the management plans is far too high. My own preference for these things, and it's being pragmatic, is to try and come down to 500 hectares for all purposes, for lotting, for management plans and for prior notification. That would give you consistency across the legislation, make it more understandable. It's imperfect in the way that Andy would describe for that.
Laurie, do you have a view, and do you have a view on why the government settled at 3,000 hectares?
So, in terms of why they settled on that figure, I don't know. They did mention the thing about family farms. I can only imagine that's probably part of it. In terms of my view, I definitely think 3,000 is too high. Point A. Point B is I think there should be uniformity between the land management plans and the transfer test lotting. And I think 500 would be much better. I think, as far as I understand it, that would make it about 2,025 landowners rather than about 420 at the moment. But really, I do think that the key thing is we need to see better justification from the Scottish Government on this and look at different options and make a decision on that basis.
Magnus.
I'm amazed to hear Andy Whiteman coming up with that figure, which seems to me just as arbitrary as 3,000 hectares or 1,000 hectares, plucked out of thin air. He himself, Andy himself, says this bill is a potential nightmare of bureaucracy. And I completely agree. And if you start bringing the threshold right down to 100 hectares, that is of a complexity and a scale and of bureaucratic intervention that I'm completely baffled by why anybody thinks that that's a good idea, because it's going to land the Land Commissioner. I hope we come back to the Land Commissioner with the most massive job, huge staff dealing with all these estates right across Scotland. We haven't even talked about the cost of all this at a time when, the government is trying to cut back. I really think that has to be confronted.
Okay, and probably we can take that up shortly. And I'm just interested in as well, just to flag up perhaps at the end, is tying land management plans in. I think there's an estate in the Highlands that has got a land management plan tied in for sale for over £10 million, and I don't think it's found a buyer because of the land management plan being undeliverable. But on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the meeting for 5 minutes, so come back here at 10:45. Just before I suspend the meeting, can I ask everyone just to stay seated for a minute? I just want to say something before we continue with the next session. So I suspend the meeting. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We'll move into the second part of the same evidence panel, and we left it with Monica with some questions on land management plans, I think.
Yeah, we're still on land management plans, so yeah, just this issue around breaches. So we've had written evidence highlighting broad concerns about the framework for alleging breaches with the requirement to produce and consult on the land management plan. So we know that the list of those who are allowed to report an alleged breach on community engagement obligations is relatively narrow. I'm going to come to Peter and Andy on that. I don't think we have Magnus at the moment, but
we're just sorting it out.
Okay.
Magnus is back.
Magnus is back. Hello. So I think this is really for Peter and Andy anyway. But in terms of that list of who can report an alleged breach, is that about right, or what are the benefits and disadvantages of having it so narrow? I'll come to Peter then Andy.
I think it's too narrow. I think there's all sorts of people who've got an interest in this that are not listed. It tends to be the statutory bodies that are there. But I mean, development trusts at a local level would have an interest. All sorts of other, properly constituted bodies would have an interest. I think if you go to other parts of the public sector, if you took the Oscar, anybody can complain about a charity that's breached that they think is breaching the rules, and anybody can complain to any kind of regulator about anything really. So I don't know why we're trying to restrict this in this way. I would have a very open, as unrestricted as one could. I think currently too that the representations on breaches are in relation to the creation of the plan, as distinct from the implementation of the plan. And again, when it came to the implementation of the plan, if the measures there were to be toughened, I would have that as open as you possibly could to let anybody make representations.
The bill only contains provisions to have a plan. There's nothing in the bill saying it must be implemented or must be followed up and all the rest of it. So that's, I agree with Peter, but it's not in the bill. This is one of these details. A plan has not been produced or the regulations have not been followed. Yes, I would expand the list. It's basically historic environment, Scotland, Scottish natural heritage, etc. Basically, anyone who could legitimately have been part of the community engagement process, I think. If I'm invited along to a meeting to discuss a management plan with my local estate, and I have a massive one in the north and a massive one in the south, and they don't produce a plan, I think I should be able to phone up the Scottish Land Commission and say, where's the plan?
So is it bizarre to have a situation where communities can be involved in the formulation of the plan, be consulted, but then have no say if the plan doesn't materialise?
Yeah. Scottish Natural Heritage and Scottish Environment Protection Agency won't know if a plan's been produced or not. Very little to do with them.
So in terms of how that's actually monitored then, do you think there should be more of a role for the Land and Communities Commissioner?
Well, I'll publish a map of all, when this bill's passed, I'll publish a map of all the estates that are meant to produce a management plan, and I'll colour them green if one's been produced and red if they're not. Citizens can do this. We don't need to get too bogged down in the minutiae of this. We're only talking about a few hundred, as currently constituted. Owners will be required to do this, and it'll be a pretty straightforward exercise to find out who's done or not, because it's meant to be publicly available.
But should we have to rely on Andy Whiteman?
No. Fix it. Yes, absolutely. But it's a detail. Yeah, it needs fixed. Yeah.
Okay. Just final question from me. I know there's a lot to get through, convener. So, on the issue of sanctions, Peter, I note that in your written evidence, you've made suggestions for further sanctions. Just keen if you can expand on that. I think one suggestion is regarding utilising powers under the Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Act 2024 to apply cross-compliance measures.
Yeah, I take the view that, as I've said already, that if Parliament is not seen to be serious about this by having proper enforcement regulations, then people will not take it seriously. So that's why I think this is important. And I think you can have staged interventions. You've got to, first of all, have a monitoring system. Once you get to a point where you believe that the thing is not being implemented in the way that you thought, then you can, I think, begin to move to a situation where you might be able to, the Land and Communities Commissioner might be able to name and shame, for example, but allow reporting on all of that, to have make an order making authority to tell an estate you've not fulfilled this obligation, I'm requiring you now to do so. So you could do that, and you can use things like cross-compliance in advance of that to say, I'm not satisfied that you're implementing this, and we're now considering whether you should receive public subsidy in the for other purposes on your estate because you're not implementing the plan. So I think you can have a staged series of interventions and with and ratcheting up the consequences with each stage.
Okay. And Magnus, would you like to add anything?
Just to say that, you know, there's already a huge amount of consultation going on with various bodies. So from my personal point of view, I mean, for instance, with our hydro scheme, you know, that has to go through the whole planning system. You are responsible to various bodies, Nature Scots, SEPA, etc. And in terms of management plan, if you're going to embark on anything in terms of tree planting or development, you almost are forced to produce a management plan. I think that Andy, when he draws up his map, will find that actually there aren't many, I can't remember which colour they're going to be coloured, but the ones that haven't produced management plans will be few and far between, simply because the requirements of planning authorities and these various agencies already, you know, things like the grouse licensing scheme, you know, huge accountability there. So it's already happening is all I'm saying.
Thank you.
Just before I move to Bob with a question on this, we've heard before somebody, I don't know who it was, that said £5,000 wasn't much money. I think it's an awful lot of money if you haven't got much money. So the question is, should it be a sliding scale? You know, if you're, you know, holding a huge tranche of land, should you be fined more than a farmer with 200 acres or 200 hectares if we're going to hectares or whatever it is that it should be? Andy, you want to come on that?
I think we'll find this all tied to the standard scales in the justice system. 5,000, I think, is the maximum a sheriff can impose, or something like that. Don't quote
so
me on
it
that.
won't be. You don't think it's right that every?
Well, you're giving this power to a civilian. You're giving this power to a member of the Scottish Land Commission. So I don't think in the law they're allowed to give more than 5,000. What would be, or they certainly can't give more than a sheriff could give. The critical thing here is to make sure that this can be recurring. So if there's a failure to do a very modest thing like produce one, never mind implementation, you get fined. You should be able to do that on a recurring basis. You should be able to do it in a year's time. And in the regulations on controlled persons that was introduced in the last Parliament, there's not. It's a one-off. So if you want to conceal your ownership in the British Virgin Islands, you just pay the £5,000 to conceal it. And that's the last you'll ever get fined. So make sure it's recurring, is all I would say. I know, yes, £5,000 is a lot, and hopefully it'll incentivise most people to comply. But I mean, if you own over 3,000 hectares and you're not interested in doing this, £5,000 is just the cost of deciding not to comply. It's, yeah. Okay. I might pay that. It's not a lot of money. If I'm paying 10 million for an estate and I don't want to produce a plan for the government, I'll pay them £5,000 not to produce a plan for the government.
Oh, very generous of you. Magnus, do you want to come in on that before I come back to...
Simply to say, by the way, which hasn't been mentioned, drawing up a management plan is not cost-free. It's an expensive thing. You may find yourself investing far more than £5,000. Believe you me, to get a, for instance, environmental impact assessment of your estate, that's £10,000 before you even begin. These are not cost-free, these management plans.
Okay. Monica, briefly, and then...
Yeah, and just to say, we did have evidence on cost, and given that large estate owners are doing the plans anyway, it doesn't feel like it will be too much of additional cost. It was just a final question for Andy, because Andy, earlier on you mentioned that the dynamic between those who live in the land and those who own the land can be difficult at times. If there are breaches, how do you think the process can be balanced to ensure there's anonymity, but also, you know, it can be as transparent as possible? Because if there's going to be a mechanism to allege breaches and you want to widen that out to practically anyone, what about those individuals who maybe are nervous about the process?
Well, it's impossible to answer that question because the obligations in In 44A are obligations that are going to be imposed by regulations. We've no idea what these obligations are going to be. There'll be some time down the line. So it's really impossible to answer that. I mean, all I would say is that people who are engaged in communities, and as I say, there's not going to be, I think it's probably less than 5% of the Scottish population will have anything to do with this because of the thresholds. Even so, you're talking about tens or hundreds of people. So there'll be at least one person who's quite free, a local doctor or somebody who's independent or the minister or whatever, who'll be able to make an allegation. But we don't know, because we have no idea what the obligations placed on owners with regard to management plans are, because they're all going to be developed by regulation.
So another area where perhaps we need to hear more from the government about.
Yeah, I mean, if the regulations are a very light touch imposition, I mean, there's some things that say they must do, then that's one thing. If they're very onerous, then that would change the dynamic quite a lot.
Thank you.
Mark, briefly.
Is that £5,000 sanction with the Register of Controlling Interest being effective, or is it too early to tell?
Not that I can tell. I did an analysis, and I think there's 60 landowners in Scotland who should have registered and they haven't.
Right.
I know there's one person who's complained to the police. I won't entertain you with the merry-go-round. But like I say, I mean, Magnus says these management plans cost a lot of money, and that's precisely why there's an incentive in people just to say, well, I'm not paying 10,000 or 20 or 30,000, I'll pay 5,000.
Okay.
Right, Bob. I think you're next with some follow-ups on this.
Can I check after the follow-up? Do you want to go into my next line of questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just get one question in this area. So putting to one side slightly whether there's powers within the bill in relation to making sure that landowners are actually following the land management plans. That's something the committee will have to weigh up when we deliberate on this. But I want to look at maybe a proactive role for the Land and Communities Commissioner. So I asked witnesses last week about, whether they should be working with landowners to share best practice, doing research work to identify trends in weak practice, and given there's restrictions on who can report breaches, whether there should be a proactive investigatory role for the Land and Communities Commissioner, irrespective of whether they received a formal complaint, maybe a small sample size to get a taste of what's actually happening out there in rural Scotland, and whether this would be desirable or not. And I know we're short of time, so just some brief consideration of that, is whether that would be in the public interest. Maybe Mr Peacock in the first instance.
I'm with you on this. I think that I thought, and I think it was in my written submission, that the Land and Communities Commissioner should have the power to instigate an investigation whether or not there's a complaint, a formal complaint, because a complaint would just be formal to act on it. And there's all sorts of informal mechanisms that exist around these things, and if they got wind that there was something discontent in the community but nobody was prepared to voice that for the kind of reasons that Monica Lennon was hinting at, then I think they should have the power to investigate at their own will. So I'm clear about that.
I think that's helpful. But if SEPA was aware of environmental damage, they wouldn't wait for a formal complaint to investigate. They just got on and do it. So there's precedents across the whole public sector, I think. Laurie McFarlane, any thoughts in relation to this?
Nothing to add, no.
So does that mean you do or don't agree with the suggestion that I made, Mr.
I agree with the broad principle, yeah, that there's a more proactive role for the Commission there, yeah.
Right, okay, thanks. Andy Whiteman?
Agree.
Okay, thank you. Magnus Linklater?
Just one extra comment on that. It depends on the makeup of the body that the Land Commissioner will be in charge of. Will he have the expertise, the knowledge, the ability to look at land management plans and question them or investigate them or challenge them if necessary? I mean, that again is a question of his powers and the expertise that he brings to bear.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'd like to move on now to Section 2, Community Right to Buy, registration of large landholding. Some initial questions that could have been answered in part in an earlier question where we're wrestling with whether 1,000 hectares was sufficient in this area. The only thing I would potentially state is that, as an urban MSP, hectares becomes a little bit meaningless. So 20 hectares is Glasgow Botanic Gardens and the grounds it sits in, which is in my constituency. So 1,000 hectares is 50 times the size of that, which does seem huge to be fair when you put it in that context. Any other brief additional comments, brief, just in relation to whether 1,000 hectares is an appropriate threshold. If you just want to restate what your position is and what the threshold should be, as arbitrary as all of this is, that would be helpful. Otherwise, we'll move on to my next line of questioning. Mr Whiteman.
Well, specifically on this is the prior notification.
Yes.
For late registrations. I mean, I do not think that's something the government should be introducing. Late registrations are meant to be an in extremis power under the 2003 Act. Now, obviously, this is being designed to capture off-market sales, where a community would not have the opportunity to do a late registration because they don't know. Now, if that's what you want to do, and I say if that's what you want to do, just create a system of notification like planning list. Just put a notification in the local paper or whatever that you intend to sell X. If that's what you want to do, do it. But I mean, if I live in a farm cottage on a landed estate in Murrayshire, and I've been living there for 30 years, and just after 5 years of tricky negotiations have managed to agree with the factor and the owner that can buy my cottage, what the hell is some community body to come along and the government's notified them because the landowner's notified them and they become a landlord?
So I think you've made your point pretty well, and I'm only cutting you off for brevity, Mr Whiteman. Yeah. But I get the point you're making. I think there's pre-notification requirements as well as like late notification requirements.
My point of that is if you bring down the threshold, this is a job creation scheme for civil servants. I mean, at the moment, the large estates like Roxburgh and Seafield and all the rest of it are doing dozens of transactions every year. All of those will go to the Scottish Government. You bring it down to 500 hectares, you're talking about thousands of transactions every year going to the Scottish Government for no purpose.
So your view is there should be no threshold?
Well, I just think the fundamental proposal that people, the whole point of community right to buy is I'm an owner of land, a community is registered and interested in this. I know that, it's registered, everyone can see it, there's a line around the map. If I want to sell that, I know what the consequences are. The rest of it, I'm free to do what I want with. Now, I'm not free to do what I want with. I have to notify the government. I've actually got more obligations on me than someone who has a community right to buy registered. And that's nonsense. This was never what late registration was designed for.
Okay, I think it goes beyond late registration, but maybe I have to just reread that section of the bill myself, Mr White, but that's very helpful, and the committee will go back and look at that. Peter Peacock.
I think that I don't know if you're going to look at prior notification in the round, but you're asking specifically about the threshold. I mean, reducing it to 500, I've already said, I think should be a universal threshold if you're having this provision. I think this provision, as Andy said, it looks as if it's designed to stop off-market sales, which are becoming a real issue. There will be other ways of tackling that particular problem. The difficulty of linking it to the particular provision of late registration is it's already well known the late registration provisions do not work. So it's a complete waste of time to do that in that sense. However, whatever the threshold and whatever that point, that doesn't deal with the other point, which is that none of this would affect your constituency. Your constituents would have no rights in this. And I think that's the point that needs to be addressed. And I think there is a mechanism. I know that you've had previous evidence that there's the notion that communities should be able in some way to record their interest in a piece of land as a piece of land of community significance. A fairly light touch mechanism which would then open up rights for communities in urban areas to have certain rights for prior notification if that existed, but also for having a management plan for particular areas of land and so on. So I think it requires a separate consideration about how you bring in urban communities into this, and there are ways of doing that.
Can I thank Mr Peacock for saving the committee time, because that was my one other question within this section before I bring colleagues in. Can I just check with Andy Whiteman before I go to Laurie? Do you agree with Mr Peacock's suggestion? It will just save me kind of coming back to as we speak around the witnesses for their views.
Do I agree with
urban communities?
In relation,
not if you're going to tie it to late notification.
In relation to sites of community significance, being caught within this, irrespective of the size of.
Well, we've already got the community right to buy. That identifies sites of community significance that any community body can register an interest in anywhere in Scotland. We've had that for 20 years for rural Scotland. We've had it for over a decade for urban. So anyone can do that, and that's the mechanism.
So we should just leave this alone then and be silent on it within this piece of legislation?
This is just a job creation scheme for civil servants who will be processing large,
that feels very
pointless
clear.
administrative.
Laurie McFarlane, I'm not sure if this is a job creation scheme or not, but perhaps you give your views on that suggestion from Mr Peacock, because you want to say anything about the threshold as well.
Well, as I said, any threshold is a very blunt instrument, and the 1,000 is, I think, too high. Even in a world where that is brought down to whether it's 500 or even 100, it still doesn't address the point that you said. And so if this particular mechanism is going ahead, and recognise Andy's concerns with that, were it to go ahead, I do think it is important that there is a mechanism to capture the exact point that you're saying, and whether that's identifying a site of community significance, what the criteria is, I think that's important to look at. But that's something, in my view, which is a bit of a glaring gap in the proposals at the moment.
All right, thank you. And finally, Magnus Linklater, I'm actually, the more and more I heard Mr Whiteman actually about his views, you've mentioned the word bureaucracy a few times in relation to a lot of this. So I don't know if there's a meeting of minds, perhaps unintentionally, in relation to some of this. What's your thoughts?
The more this goes on, the more I find I'm agreeing with Andy. I wouldn't... I think the thresholds are arbitrary, but I wouldn't be in favour of lowering to the levels that have been suggested for the very reasons that Andy himself has spelled out, and I agree with that. Just one quick word about communities and identifying communities. As I understand it, within the bill, the Land Commissioner will have a list of communities who've already expressed an interest. As it were, they're standing by, waiting, in case there is a proposed sale, at which point they will be brought into play. And one of my questions would be, who are those communities? How are they identified? And what do they have to demonstrate to show that they have a legitimate interest in a community buyout? And how would they improve the use of the land and improve it over its present use? I think that's a very interesting question. It's not really been addressed.
Mr Linklater, just, and I said that was my final question, this would just be to yourself as well, Mr Linklater, does that maybe give a real rationale for land management plans and community consultation? Because if they're done properly and ethically and appropriately and professionally, then the landowner will work collegiately and build up a relationship with those communities and build capacity. So is that a potential positive outcome of a good quality land management plan?
I don't know whether a land management plan is on the public record and therefore accessible to the local community. I'm not particularly in favour of working, as you put, collegiately with the local community, because every local community has a divergence of interest. You find 6 different people with 6 different views as to what to be done. But a land management plan, presumably, is published.
I would presume so. We can clarify that, but yes, but I think it's self-evident from the legislation the community should be involved in the consultation process. But I'll leave it there. Perhaps that's something the committee has to return to, convener.
And Douglas has waited patiently and quietly. Now is your moment, Douglas.
Yeah, and we're sticking to the community right to buy process. Really keen to know whether the government have found the right balance between public and private interests, particularly in relation to the timescales, to the length that a transfer is prohibited. So maybe come to you first of all, Magnus. Do you have views on that, where landowners won't be able to sell land and obviously give some time to communities to almost have first refusal?
The one case I know about which exists at the moment is the purchase of the island of Ulva, which was originally planned as a private sale, and then when the local community heard about it, they registered an interest. At that stage, any private sale was stopped, and they were given quite a generous timescale within which to come forward with a plan, and they were helped by civil servants in the Scottish government to prepare that plan. So there is already considerable leeway given to local communities to come forward with a proposal to get it right and to be given the information they need in order to get it right. So I'm not quite sure whether this bill reinforces that, expands it or not, but I would have said that communities already have considerable powers to prepare a bid.
Okay, thanks, Magnus. Anybody else like to comment? Peter?
Yeah, I mean, the reason it's there to pick up Magnus's point is it's just to deal with the land that never comes on the market because it's done privately, and so it's to bring visibility to that. On your question about timescales, I mean, the evidence I've heard and I've read that you've already received is that the timescales are simply impractical for communities. They just wouldn't work, and therefore they require to be extended. Now, I think that the extension of those timescales I don't see as particularly problematic in this sense, that if, as I've stressed throughout my evidence, this is all about achieving the public interest, then taking a bit of time to work out what the public interest is and making proper decisions just takes a bit of time. And so I don't think the timescales are achievable as they stand and require to be extended.
And what do you think would be an adequate timescale for communities to get their act together?
I'm not sufficiently expert on this to offer you a figure, but I know that those that who are dealing with these things every day and day in and day out have already advised the committee on that, and I would go with what they've said, to be honest.
I think it's 75 days that they're given, and I think there was an argument, 70 days, I think there was an argument that that was insufficient. Sorry, Douglas, just to put that on.
Laurie, Andy, any comments on that? Or?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think the 30 and 40-day window is very tight and out with very specific conditions where there is a sort of pre-existing eligible community body ready to go, which in the case of land which hasn't been sold for a very long time probably isn't the case. And so I don't think that that's long enough. I think there's also a question about the definition of community in that early stage process and perhaps broadening that out. But I think just taking a step back, I do think that fundamentally these changes in particular, if the goal here is to try and promote more community ownership, I don't think this is really going to make a great deal of difference overall.
Okay. Andy?
If you want longer timescales, use the existing mechanism that's been there for 20 years, which is the community right to buy. Register the interest, and then you get long time sales, 6 months or something. So I just wouldn't have this provision at all. I mean, if you want to capture off-market sales of large estates, make a public notification system. That's all you need to do. And if you, as I say, if you're going to reduce this threshold to 500 hectares, you're literally going to have thousands and thousands of bits of garden, 100 square metres to expand the vehicle entrance for a builder's yard. My cottage I've been living in for 30 years I want to buy. You're going to have thousands of these things going into the Scottish Government, go up to the Land Commissioner roundabout and achieving precisely nothing. This is a really stupid policy.
Okay. I think we've heard you loud and clear. So, obviously, do you think, obviously, the government are just making this over complex? Do you think we should just look at reviewing the existing right to buy process that's already under review and just get that right?
There's no way government should be introducing a bill that introduces new, unprecedented, legalistic and bureaucratic processes to an existing act that's been there for 20 years, when at the same time they're intending to review that act. That makes absolutely no sense at all. There's been calls in Parliament since 2006, was the first I can remember, to review the community right to buy, because it has delivered 0.24% of Scotland into community hands in 20 years. So it'll deliver 1.4% by the end of the century, 5% by the end of the millennium, 10%, no, yeah, whatever it is, right? So belatedly we're going to have a review done by civil servants, which is not good enough, because internally civil servants are not, we're getting off topic there.
Yes, you are. But it was very small, the changes, I think, that you were saying. Kevin wants to come in as a supplementary when you finish, Douglas.
And I'm going to go off topic a little bit as well, and go back to some of the comments that Laurie made earlier, and we can have very brief answers, I think, here, Convener. And my question is this bill an appropriate vehicle for introducing compulsory sale orders? Laurie?
I don't see any reason why not.
Thank you. Peter?
I would support that, absolutely.
Andy? Please. Yes. Magnus, please?
No.
OK, there we go. That was quick.
Okay, Convener. Without explanation, Kevin. Douglas, I wasn't sure if you'd finished.
No, I'm done, Convener.
Okay, then we come to the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Hi, we've touched on this issue to some degree in earlier answers, but I'd like to maybe just dig a wee bit deeper in it, and that's the provisions around lotting within the bill itself. And to get your view on whether you think the provisions that have been put in the bill for lotting are right, are workable, and what you think their potential impact would be in helping to diversify potential land ownership in the future. Andy?
I don't think we'll have any impact at all. In my written evidence, I present to you my assessment of qualifying sales over the last 3 years. showing how it will have very limited impact at all. And bearing in mind that I've been looking at land sales since 1993. I've got a collection of over 4,000 sales particulars that are currently on their way to the National Library of Scotland. Many parcels of land in Scotland are lotted when they're sold. If I own a 2,000 hectare estate and my advisors tell me that I'll get more money in aggregate if I sell the houses separately and the farm and some development land and whatever, generally speaking, I'll do that. I may not do it. I may have some bizarre wish to make sure it always stays in one lot, but I'm selling it, so I've got no control. So that's a pretty pointless wish. So it's lotted already. And land that is not really capable of being lotted, but land that would, if lotted, would probably reduce in value, will not be lotted. So it's going to be very, very rare. There's only about 8 qualifying sales a year, right? Out of which you'll be lucky if there's one every 5 years that would be appropriate to lot. The government's going to step in and lot them. It's going to have to pay compensation if that lotting results in a lower aggregate sales value to the owner. It's not going to diversify ownership because there's no public interest test on the buyer. So Scotland's land is getting more concentrated. My recent republication of the book, we've now got 421 owners owning 50% of Scotland's privately owned land, down from 440 in 2012. We've got 2,589 owning 70%, down from 3,161 in 2012. So if you lot it, anyone, Gresham House, any investor can come in and buy the lot. They're just going to increase the concentration because they're the ones that are concentrating land ownership. And you're prohibited from one person buying more than one lot, but that's fine because 6 months later they can sell it to each other anyway, and there's no control over that because it's under the 1,000 hectare threshold by that time. If you're going to lot, look at, for example, the sale of a French investment company. I did a blog on this recently called Woodland Invest, and they've got a significant ownership by the French State Investment Bank, which was set up by Louis XVI, I think. They own a 2,500 portfolio of property in Scotland, 16 separate properties from Aberdeenshire down to Argyll and the borders. There's one in your constituency, I think, Mr Matheson, of Sloman, if I'm right, maybe not in your constituency, but it's close by. That is what you want to lot, because the folk in Sloman might like a community woodland, the farmers in Aberdeenshire might like some woodland for a bit of shelter, a community in Argyll might want a community woodland, lot that, but that's going to be sold as one job lot, because it doesn't meet the threshold. It's over 1,000 hectares, but it's completely disaggregated. That's precisely where you could step in and say, wait a minute, if you're selling 16, or there's some portfolios for sale of about 30 or 40 properties in Scotland, if that's what you're going to do, that's when you step in the lot. So I think the impact will be very, very minimal, partly on the ownership, yes, because they're just going to be able to sell to each other afterwards. I can make a back deal room with you. You buy that lot, I buy this lot. In a year's time, I sell it to you.
Okay. Peter?
I think this is a very important point of principle that the bill opens up for the very first time. I mean, at the present day, it seems absurd, but it is the case that Scottish ministers, on behalf of the public interest, cannot ask any questions about land sales of scale. It's simply, they're no power to do that. And for the very first time, as a matter of principle, this gives Scottish ministers powers to intervene in the scale of land sales. So from that point of view, as a point of principle, this is mightily significant that it's on the face of the bill. So to that extent, I think that's very useful ground to have made in this bill, and I would support it. However, it does also open up, therefore, the potential for greater diversity of land. However, as drafted, it's not going to deliver very much at all, I don't think. It's too timid. It makes no real material difference. And that's because the threshold is too high, but also the way in which decisions about lotting would be made are not clear on the bill. There's hints in the policy memorandum, but it's not clear on the face of the bill. And it comes to this question of the lotting decision being the transfer test. Why have we chosen a transfer test rather than a wider public interest test? And I've made points about the public interest test before and its significance for ECHR questions. So I think that would require attention, and that is potentially capable of being done in the ways that I've previously hinted at about how you could define the public interest test and the considerations within that. I think I agree with Andy to this extent that it doesn't address the question of the purchaser, and I've also made comments on that earlier, and I won't repeat those. And again, I think the timescales here are too short. So there would be practical things you could do to make this provision more effective, but as it stands, it's not going to make much difference, I'm afraid, notwithstanding this is a really important principle to have established about ministerial say-so over land sales of scale. First time ever.
Laurie.
So I agree that as currently drafted in the bill, I think the proposals around lotting are going to have a very, very, very small impact, if anything at all. I do think lotting might have a role to play overall if it's tied into, as we said earlier, a much sort of broader concept of the public interest and a public interest test, as was outlined in the consultation, which one outcome, possible outcome of could be lotting. I think there's the issues of the sort of aggregated landholdings that Andy talked about, which is really important, and that there's a risk that we're not actually capturing some of the main drivers here of the growing concentration of land ownership in Scotland. My understanding is that under the proposals here, there's no regulation over who can actually buy the land, apart from being not more than one person be able to buy more than one piece, which I think is a big issue. And I do think, mentioned earlier, this concept of community sustainability seeming to be the driving factor here, which is sort of ill-defined. And so, for me, I think the big change here should be to move away from this transfer lotting test towards a public interest test at the point of transfer or sale, guided by that well-understood concept of the public interest. And again, considering these aggregate landholding issues that Andy mentioned. I do think it's worth also mentioning, just to put on the record though, even if we did go down that route with a public interest test at the point of sale or transfer, that in and of itself, it might help stop future growing concentration of land ownership. It's not going to tackle the existing pattern of land ownership, because most land never actually comes on the market for sale. And so I do think, again, if the Scottish Government is serious in wanting to tackle that issue, that these issues alone aren't going to do that. They might stop things from getting worse, but they're not going to look at getting better. And I do think that it's also worth considering the principle, at least, of having a mechanism with a sufficiently high threshold of a public interest test on existing land holdings, where there is very clear evidence where land is not being managed in the public interest, again, with suitable mechanisms in place. And I think an important point to mention here is that the benefit of a public interest test isn't just in its actual application, just going around doing lots of public interest tests. The very existence of that mechanism in place would be enough to help drive behavioural change in the market, landowners knowing that there's a possibility of having a public interest test, therefore not wanting one, and therefore ensuring that they are managing land in the public interest itself. And so there's a key point there about the existence of mechanisms driving behavioural change, rather than just going around actually doing lots of these things, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Magnus, do you want to comment on the issue of lotting?
I do. And Laurie has put great emphasis on public interest. But what about the private interest? I mean, this is where the ECHR comes into play, I think, because there's been a suggestion that lotting improves the value of the land. My experience is probably suggests the opposite, that what a community will want to buy, that lotting is there so that the community is given the opportunity to purchase a bit of land rather than having to raise the funds to buy the whole lot. So they buy their eye falls inevitably on the productive bit of land, and that will excite interest. That's what they will raise the funds for, and that's what they will want to buy. Leaving the landowner, who needs to sell, presumably, otherwise he wouldn't have put it on the market, with, unproductive land, whose value, deprived of that bit, falls considerably. Now, reading the bill, as I understand it, at that stage, the government will step in and compensate. And I'm amazed that actually this is being proposed, because that's an extra cost to government. I think it raises so many different questions. I mean, I've mentioned already an estate like ours, which has a hydro scheme, which only works on the whole thing. Lot that land and you chop off half of it. I'm sure that applies to many other large estates where they will find that there are productive bits and non-productive bits, and the ones that a community will want to get their hands on are the productive bits. So already you're setting up the possibility of a challenge under the ECHR, undermining property rights and devaluing land. So I think that has to be considered.
Okay. I want to turn briefly to the issue of the idea of a public interest test, which a number of you have mentioned as well. Given the bill proposes the transfer test as set out, the original consultation was looking at the idea of a public interest test, and the Scottish Land Commission recommended a public interest test. My first question is, do you understand why the Scottish Government chose to introduce a transfer test rather than a public interest test?
Speaking for myself, I don't. I'm perplexed by this, frankly. I think it's a misstep. For the reasons I've set out and others have set out, it's very important to frame this as a public interest test. It's why the Land Commission did so. And I just don't understand why they've got to this position. It weakens the whole provision pretty dramatically, in my view. Maybe that's the reason why advice might have been given to ministers about that. But I just don't think this is the right place to be. And a public interest test, as Laurie said, is well-established routines in legislative terms, well-established in law, and you can define that in the ways that many of us have rehearsed.
So my second question then is, can any of you see merit in a transfer test as opposed to a public interest test from your differing perspectives?
Short answer, no.
No. Magnus?
No.
Magnus, would you prefer a public interest test on the face of the bill rather than a transfer test as it's drafted at the moment? In terms of giving greater, in order to give greater transparency as to what the intention of the test is?
I'm beginning to sound like a stuck record, but it just depends on your definition of public interest. I return to I think my test is very different from that of Peter's and Laurie's, for instance. My test of public interest is to do with the use of the land, whether it is in the interests of fighting climate change or biodiversity. On the other hand, if it's farming land, whether it is being farmed sustainably and productively, all those things seem to me to be a definition of public interest and far more important than the idea of simply distributing land and distributing wealth.
Okay. It was suggested earlier on, Magnus, in your contribution that the best way in which to attract investment in issues around woodland and peatland restoration programmes is on larger estates because of their ability to attract investment, particularly private sector investment. Can you maybe just expand on why you believe that's the case, and can I ask the other panel members whether they agree with that view?
It's not, actually, interestingly, the case is being made not in terms of private investment, but in terms of the people who are arguing for it are the very people like the Scottish Woodland Trust, like Nature Scott, like the RSPB, who see the totality of a biodiversity scheme as being greatly enhanced if estates join up and come up with a composite plan. So it's not me really arguing that case. It is bodies who are, cited as authorities and called into play by the Scottish Government itself. It's a very interesting argument, and as I think Andy or Peter rather has already said, somebody like Anders Poulsen is rewilding all across Scotland. Nobody is criticising him for that. Indeed, they're applauding him for that. Yet he is now the largest landowner in Scotland. I mean, I'm not necessarily complaining about that, but I do think there's an inherent contradiction there.
Andy?
Well, obviously, it's a statement of the obvious that if you want to manage land at scale for whatever purpose, you need to manage land at scale. But the ownership doesn't really matter. I mean, there are risks. If you want to manage land at the scale of 10,000 hectares, there might, I stress, might be a benefit in having one owner in that 10,000 hectares, but only if they agree to do it. If they don't, you're stuffed. If Mr Poulsen had different motives, it would be very different. And that's precisely a good example of why there should be a public interest test. Glenfeshie had a management plan. There was a nature reserve agreement since 1955, I think. I campaigned at the Rio Earth Summit on the deforestation of Glenfeshie. I had the copy in my hand then. It was routinely ignored, and it took him to come in and restore the place. But the point is, there was no public interest test. There should have been. We would have looked at Mr Paulson's plans and his money and probably said, yes, fine, great. So the argument that he's come in and done that is actually an argument that supports the liberal free market in land with no constraints at all, and you just happen to get lucky with him if you believe that Glenfeshie needs restored. But you can do it by cooperation. Magnussen's answered his own question. I mean, you have landowners operating at scale in continental Europe. You have in Finland 125,000 members of one of the biggest forest products companies in the world. They're small family forest farms. You have Södercell in southern Sweden, 57,000. You have all the Brittany farmers who still control 55% of Brittany ferries. When you go for your holiday in France, you're giving French farmers money. You cooperate. Now, it's easier to cooperate with 4 people, yes, but the risks in that are that if 3 of them don't, it's not. It's difficult to cooperate with 10,000, yes, but, you know, and that's where you've got to get a balance between government saying, look, we need to restore these peatlands over 10,000 hectares. It doesn't really matter how many landowners there are. We're going to do it, and these are your obligations. So this is a complete red herring, this idea that you need scale of ownership to achieve scale of management.
Peter? I concur with that last summation there, that it's a red herring. And, you know, if you look at Scotland, which is why I made my opening remarks in the way I did, in comparison to most of the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, we are the aberrant nation. We are the one that sticks out as being very odd indeed. Does that mean that rural France or rural Sweden or rural Finland or rural Norway is lacking in investment and is failing to meet its environmental obligations? Absolutely not. They're excelling in some of these matters. So it's not a question of scale of ownership. I mean, the arguments for the scale of ownership being left alone are basically economic arguments, which is leave the status quo, leave that accumulation of wealth, leave the accumulation of power in the current hands. And that's why governments of all persuasions in the Scottish context since devolution have argued for more diversification of ownership. It's precisely to address these broader societal questions. Also, if you go to Africa and other parts of the world where you'll have literally thousands of smallholders cooperating together to recreate some of the biggest forests on the planet at the present time. It's not a question of who owns the land, it's a question of what's in the public interest and how you drive that progress. And you know, it's a diversion from the need to look at diversification of ownership. It's to argue for the status quo.
Laurie?
Yeah, I concur with the previous speakers on that. I think the idea that having a very concentrated pattern of land ownership is somehow some benefit to attracting investment in nature restoration, I think, is fairly thin. If that were the case, then we would potentially be at a significant advantage compared to European neighbours when it comes to delivering things like nature restoration. And I think that evidence isn't bared out. One final brief point just to add, I think, just coming back to the Anders Paulson point, is ultimately that landowners who are managing land well in the public interest shouldn't have anything to fear from a public interest test, because they're already doing that, if you like. And indeed, we often hear from that sector that they are already doing this, and if that's the case, there should be nothing to fear from having this mechanism.
Okay, thanks.
Just before we leave that, I just want to go back to something that was questioned earlier. Is that the lotting is triggered if you've got a estate of a certain size and you want to sell something off. Now, what we heard when we did one of our visits, that there are often sales going on numerous bases, houses, little bits of ground for a pony paddock or an extension to the garden, and that if somebody came along and asked an estate whether they'd sell them their house, the estate has to say absolutely nothing, pull the shutters down and contact the Scottish ministers. Is that progressive or is that overkill?
I think you make the same point that Andy Whitman made earlier, and it's a fair point. I mean, there would be merit in looking at some de minimis level, so you're talking about a threshold level. There's also a case for looking at the other end at a de minimis level. I mean, nobody wants to clutter up the system. It's in nobody's interest to do that. That's not to say that there aren't arguments in favour of lotting.
Okay, and then the other question is that I struggle, and I've struggled when we talked about natural capital, about, say, for example, Gresham House, and they have relatively small holdings scattered across Scotland, but become quite a big landowner when you put them all together. So I'm not sure I've heard on the lotting argument how you deal with that.
Well, as I mentioned, the previous example of Woodland Invest, which is currently on the market, you make whatever threshold. If you're going to have a threshold, you apply whatever threshold you do to land that is not contiguous. I mean, there's 1,000-hectare holdings that are not contiguous because there's a railway running through them. I've got one locally. Just because there's a railway running through them, they're out of scope. The test for whether people have got a common interest is about whether they touch. So the easiest way to do that is just to sell that to somebody for a house or something to make sure they don't touch, and then you're out of that. The avoidance is really easy in this. You just set up a holding company, you hold your estate in a subsidiary, Company A, and when you want to transfer any land, you transfer it to Company B, but that's an exempt transfer under the Community Right to Buy, and then you sell the shares in Company B. It's really, really easy to do that. And that is the problem, that if you want to do something, make sure it's going to have decent outcomes and make sure it's going to work. If it's not, the default position is don't do it, because you're just going to have judicial reviews, legal challenges, highly bureaucratic, job creation schemes in the civil service, and a lot of people get incredibly frustrated.
I mean, the problem then becomes on lotting, as I understand it, is that, and having done it when I was a surveyor, it's quite an art to get the lotting right and to make sure, and usually do it based on the information as you know who wants what, and you do it. And there may be an argument for selling the whole estate, and so you have one buyer and it becomes easier, and then let that person then break it up and sell it on at a profit and carry the risk if they get left with it. My question is, how much do you think, I mean, this is the never-ending question. We've got a financial memorandum which says that the costs are relative, or will say the costs are relatively small. If there's compensation for that, surely the cost could be massive. Do you want to come in on that, Magnus?
Do you mean compensation for land that is lotted but not sold?
No, if it's lotted, not in the way to achieve the best possible price, and the government has to compensate the landowner, it could be massive, couldn't it?
It could, and I think I hope you're going to come back to the question of the powers of the Land Commissioner, because after all, that's where the powers to make these decisions will lie. I want to just pick up. Laurie uttered the word nothing to fear. Those who manage their land well will have nothing to fear. There are those of us who feel a wee chill going down the spine when we hear that phrase, because there are people who will decide that we have everything to fear if they decide that we're not using the land properly.
Andy, I don't know if you were leaning forward on the compensation issue and whether there could be a huge bill if lotting was done in a certain way.
Well, in my written evidence, I look at the qualifying sales over the last 3 years. I make an assessment of how many would be lotted. I mean, I can give the committee each estate and the sales particulars, and you can have a look at it yourself. In my recollection, you know, about, if there's 8 over 3 years at 24, I think less than 3 or 4 were lotted. And those lots were really just a couple of houses plus the rest. So I don't think ministers are going to lot stuff if they're advised by the Communities Commissioner or whoever that this may devalue the estate, because they will open themselves up to compensation. So that'll be a decision that ministers make at the time. I think potentially, in theory, the bill could be huge. But if the bill is huge, the ministers are not going to lot.
I think you can, if I'm correct, I would need to go back and check this, but I'm pretty certain the existing land reform legislation that's on the statute book has also got provisions for compensation to owners in certain circumstances. So this is not new territory in that sense. And, you know, if you want to, I mean, I'm not rehearsing the merits or demerits of the particular proposal. If you want to see a more diversified land ownership pattern in Scotland, which has been consistent policy from the majority of parties for all those years, then, you know, relative to the scale of the value of the land in Scotland and the market for land in Scotland, the sums that we're talking about are minuscule. So I think it's well worth the price.
Okay, I mean, I'm just concerned that if some areas are designated as only suitable for community to purchase, it blights the value on the land. As a surveyor, ex-surveyor, I would say that.
You know, I think it's something that Magnus misunderstands my position on this as well, that I think one of the weaknesses of the bill and the weakness of the argument about land reform in the round at the moment is that it is always equated with community ownership. I don't see it that way. I want to see hundreds more private owners as well as I want to see community owners. It's a question of how you diversify ownership and widen opportunity in land, and I don't see that as purely a community thing. I'm a huge advocate and fan of community ownership. I want to see much more of it, but it's not the only dimension to land reform.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next non-controversial part of it, which is the Land and Communities Commissioner, because it seems to be non-controversial this morning. Is it a standalone role, or should it be incorporated in the works of the existing commissioners? And in fact, what are your views on where it's laid out in the bill? So, Magnus, you've expressed some opinion on this, so I'll let you go first.
Well, I think that as laid out in the proposed bill, the Land Commissioner is going to have huge powers, powers which could be challenged under the ECHR if he went too far. So the first step, I would suggest, is maximum accountability in the first place. This has got to be a very well debated and open process as to how this appointment is made, what powers they have. As I said, some lawyers think those powers are extraordinary. And if that is the case, then they need to be well laid out, well questioned, well challenged if necessary. And then the other point that I've made before is that the expertise of the team under the Land Commission, they must be close to the land. They mustn't be, civil servants looking into laptops. They need to be people who understand how the land is used, what the best use of the land is, and to be able to judge if a land management plan isn't working, why it's not working. Not that not simply a box-ticking exercise, but people who really understand farming and the use of land. So this is a big big proposal in the bill. The job itself the post itself has enormous powers. And so it needs to be properly scrutinised before it is put in place.
Okay, Peter, you have some doubts. I'm going to let you voice them.
I want to take this very rare opportunity to almost agree with Magnus Linklater on this. I think that I've got very major concerns about the way this is being established, I have to say. The status of the position, the relationship between the Land and Communities Commissioner and the Land Commission. And on the face of the bill, there's no guidance given to the Land Commissioner on how to exercise their role. For the exercise of their functions, they are wholly detached from the Commission. It's almost like they're only at the Commission to receive their pay and rations, as they would have said at one time. And for the rest, they've got entire discretion over what they do. I just don't think that can be appropriate. It's not appropriate. It's not conducive to good governance, it doesn't seem to me. It's not conducive to good accountability, as Magnus said. I don't think that there's any alignment necessary between the Land and Communities Commissioner and the policies of the Commission, and that just seems bizarre, that to be part of a corporate entity and yet have no requirement to have consideration for the policies of that entity seems to me bizarre. And I think there's a case for actually vesting the powers of the Commissioner in the entire Commission rather than a single individual. So I do think there's a strong need to amend this. I don't think it would be difficult to do, Convener. You could oblige the Commissioner to consult with the wider Commission on any guidance they're going to issue, on any decisions or recommendations they're proposing to make, on any codes of practice they're intended to issue. They should have to exercise their powers having regard to the policies of the Commission. They should formally probably report to the Commission Chair in some way. And they should have their actions as a Commissioner designed to advance the public interest in a variety of ways. So major concerns here, but I don't think this is unamendable, and I hope that the committee will recommend to do that.
This is getting the free spirit of the Land Commissioner, like we have for the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and not making the Land Commissioner a regulatory body, which is the issue. Andy, you had some concerns as well.
Yes, I mean, obviously the proposal to establish a Land Communities Commissioner is by modifying Section 4 of the 2016 Act. So they are going to be part of the Scottish Land Commission. They'll be, and all the rest of it. But it does, as you say, follow the tenant-farmer one. The view was taken in 2016 that there should be one individual who was responsible for tenant farming issues. And that was partly, as my understanding was at the time, to be able for that individual, rather than commission corporately, which is a kind of faceless organisation, if you like, but for that individual, who hitherto has been Bob McIntosh, to develop a relationship with landowners and tenants whereby they were trusted. That was the theory behind it, and I think, broadly speaking, it's worked. He's done a very good job to build trust in a very historically difficult environment. The new one, therefore, does have some bespoke powers, like the Land and Communities Commissioner. But I agree with Peter. I think these functions should be given to the Commission corporately. I don't think it needs a Commissioner who's specifically got these obligations. My other worry and concern is that the Commission is a relatively new body. It only picked up its powers, I think, in April 2017. It is an advisory body. It's a statutory advisor to ministers, and it produces guidance and good practice and general good works and all the rest of it. Its duties are set down in the 2016 Act. So it's a relatively new body. We are giving it regulatory powers, which it's never had before. Now, you think of bodies like SEPA. We all know it's a regulatory body. You pollute, they might come and get you. Scottish Natural Heritage, for example, has long been a statutory advisor to ministers, but also has some regulatory powers. But it's been around since 1992. So giving a relatively new body that is still developing trust a new member who's got regulatory powers and the power to issue fines, I think needs to be thought about. And I would ask the committee to invite the Land Commission to tell them how much consultation was held with the Scottish Land Commission as to whether they want this. My understanding is they got the bill the day before publication. So I think this is a governance question, okay? To maintain the integrity and the trust that's been built up by the Scottish Land Commission, to ensure that the powers that are delivered effectively and don't... because you could have the Scottish Land Commissioner potentially fining somebody that they're also working with on a best practice scheme. That doesn't stack up for me. So give it to the Commission as a whole, would be my recommendation. OK. Laurie, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much, no. I think sounds like there's pretty broad consensus among all of us here. I think this is an area which needs to be looked at in quite a bit more detail, including the role of the Commissioner vis-à-vis the Commission, but also the tension that Andy mentioned there of the Commission's role as providing advice to the Scottish Government and also executing a new regulatory function. And I think, based on what we're seeing in the bill, etc., I think we need to look at this in a bit more detail before going ahead.
Okay, so on the face of the bill, doesn't, I don't think, specify specific skills and expertise for this new commissioner. But what it does say is that it can't be a large landowner. They're automatically disqualified. So I'm not quite sure I understand that, and I'm not sure I quite understand why there aren't skills there. The Tenant Farming Commissioner had to have skills and came, I remember his first interview at the committee when he came into the Eclair Committee. Andy, you want to say something? Well,
in Section 6 it says the Scottish Ministers must ensure that the person appointed has expertise or experience in A, land management, B, community empowerment. So, I mean, there are some, OK, that's broad, but there are qualifications there. I mean, the reason why they're prohibited from being a large landowner is because there's no way, I mean, this is rather like the wider point. Scottish ministers own 10% of Scotland. And if they want to sell an old forestry store, they have to notify themselves so that Scottish ministers can inform somebody else as if they want to buy it, or if they want to lot it, they have to inform themselves that they might want it. It's a massive conflict of interest in Scottish ministers, and that needs to be dealt with, and it's not dealt with. And that's going to be the first Scottish minister sale is going to be judicially reviewed, because the person making a regulatory decision about notifying communities or doing lotting cannot be the same person that owns it. Now, if that principle holds, and I think it does for Scottish ministers, it also holds for the Commissioner. Because if the convener chose, after this term in office here, to retire from being an MSP and take up a position here, and owned over 1,000 hectares, and had to investigate himself, there's no court in the land would uphold the integrity of that investigation. So my understanding is that's why that's there, and it's perfectly sensible.
Hypothetically, of course, because I don't own over 1,000 hectares, and I don't think I'm likely to. I am a small family farm. Magnus, do you have a view on this?
On what?
on whether the skills specified for the Commissioner are sufficient and whether landowners should be excluded from being a land commissioner, large landowners.
I can see on the surface that there will be a huge conflict of interest in having a landowner taking up that job, but I think as Andy has said, it's pretty well specified that they've got to have the skills, and I just emphasise again that the skills in the body as a whole, and if it's going to be a corporate representing the Land Commission as presently constituted, then presumably they will bring that expertise to bear. One other thing, they will have the power to impose fines. We've talked about fines, and those can be challenged in court. So this bill, the reason it's so sort of intricately drafted, and we haven't really talked about the complexity of this bill. I mean, I've sat up with a wet towel around my head reading this thing, and some of it is nightmarish in the convoluted way in which it's expressed, and all that suggests a bill that is unconfident about what it's being asked to deliver, but what it's very trying to do is to ensure it doesn't end up in the Supreme Court, and that is a high risk because there's so much in this bill that can be challenged, and you know, well, the powers of the Land Commissioner go to the heart of this, because if he or she has the ability to impose fines, then he or she is accountable in the courts, and they will be challenged if they haven't got it right.
Interesting, and I think lotting is a specific skill that not everyone has, and I wouldn't even say after 15 years of being a land agent I would be confident to do it correctly. Peter.
Point, I think too that there's a need for the bill to address the question of updating the Land Commission's own functions, because it is now a decade old. It would have to reflect these new responsibilities, for one, I think, and that's not addressed as I see it. But also, it doesn't address things that, like Monica Lennon and others have asked questions about the Land Commission helping or facilitate or advance community wealth building or a just transition. So I think there's some refreshing of their functions required to complement this.
Okay. Now, Rhoda, who's waited very patiently, gets her moment. Rhoda, over to you.
Thank you. Can I just, my questions are really going back over some of the things, and maybe one thing that is more substantive, but you all talked about urban land reform and the way that that could be incorporated in the bill by categorising the land as land of community significance. And I wonder if that needs to go into the bill separately, or could that categorisation be used for rural land as well?
Well, I mean, if you wish to make new designations about land of community significance, be my guest. I would suggest that it's not the time to be introducing new designations. You know, the community right to buy exists, the neglected and abandoned land, the sustainable development. We've added all of these things, and together, you know, I mean, the Duke of Buccleuch has redistributed over 31,000 hectares in the last 10 years. All of these bits of legislation passed by the Parliament have redistributed less than 30. So my inclination would be not to introduce new ones, but if you want to do it, make sure you know, what it's designed to achieve and all the rest of it. In terms of the urban context, I mean, I was giving a talk in Peoples the other week. Peoples has got about 300 or 400 acres of community-owned land. Its problem is not that it doesn't have community wealth in Peoples. Its problem is that the common good of the Royal Borough of Peoples is controlled by 4 councillors, only one of whom lives in Peoples. And the simple way to do that is to amend the 1491 and 1973 Common Good Act to give the people of Peoples back the control and ownership of their land. So there's things we can do in urban Scotland that would be hugely empowering. We could give the people of Aberdeen proper control of their common good fund, and Inverness, I mean, these are multi-million-pound funds. There's lots we could be doing in urban Scotland. I wouldn't bring the late registration provisions and the lotting into urban Scotland. I've already, because you're talking about then bringing down the scale and threshold down to something like, you know, a hectare or something, if you want to have that any meaningful effect. And I've already mentioned, as drafted, you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of notifications coming into Scottish ministers. They'll be drowned in it if you were to introduce these provisions into urban Scotland. These ones.
I think that the part of the dilemma here is that this bill doesn't deal with the community right to buy. And it's well understood, as Andy said back when I was a member of this Parliament back in 2011, the then Rural Affairs Committee commissioned work on that, and it demonstrated it didn't work. And we're now, 13 years later, and we haven't actually dealt with it. And the reason why the lighter touch areas of community significance, I think, is a necessary innovation. It builds on what the experience is south of the border, where this exists, as a lighter touch mechanism. And the reason that's required is because for many urban communities, in fact, almost any community in Scotland now, to use the provisions of the Community Right to Buy in the 2003 Act has become so cumbersome and bureaucratic and difficult and almost impossible to maintain over a period of time, that's why there's a look for a different mechanism in urban Scotland. How that's done technically, I don't know. I think it would be a missed opportunity not to use this bill, however, to establish that urban communities have got community rights as well, and not to depart from that. And I think there's merit in considering the areas of community significance quite closely. And others have done quite detailed work on this that I'm sure would illuminate how this could be done.
Yeah, just on the point about community significance, so for me, I think in the context, if we're looking at a public interest test rather than the sort of existing transfer test, and in the discussion about thresholds being lower, I think in that world, I think looking at something like community significance to bring in some of that stuff, the urban stuff, is useful. If, however, we're just talking about the existing plans within the bill on the transfer test and lotting, I don't necessarily think that is worth pursuing. So this would only really be in the context of were it to evolve into a public interest test. Just more widely, though, on the urban point, I mean, I think we've already talked about the fact that community right to buy isn't really materially strengthened through the bill, and there's a separate thing going on. So that's one thing to say. Compulsory sale orders we've already brought up, and Andy mentioned the common good stuff, which again is not in here, but I think I don't see why it shouldn't be, all of which pertains to urban. And then the other thing that I mentioned at the beginning is in relation to land for housing, in particular, which there are things that I think would be good to see which aren't in here. And again, we've got a separate thing happening in parallel on compulsory purchase, which I think also confuses things as well.
Okay, thank you. My other question is around natural capital, and I don't think we've really tackled this. We know that people invest in planting trees and all those other things and use that to offset bad behaviour elsewhere. So those people can buy leases or control over that land for quite a long period of time into the future. And so they might not own the land, but they control the land. And should this bill be looking at how the land is controlled? Because it's certainly not in the public interest to be controlling land to offset polluting behaviour elsewhere. Is this bill an opportunity to tackle this? Should it be doing that? And if so, how?
I've got Magnus's hand up and Andy Whiteman. Probably, Rhoda, would you mind if Magnus went first and then go to Andy?
Natural capital is still in a sort of formative stage, and not many people fully understand what it is. Basically, it's taking an area of land and deciding what it contributes to tackling climate change and biodiversity. So it includes tree planting, for instance, which, for its carbon capture potential, but also things like peatland restoration, water replenishment, all that kind of thing. And in totality, it amounts to a thing called natural capital. And the argument is that you may find private investors who are prepared to invest in that to burnish their own carbon credentials. Actually, this private investment is encouraged by people like Nature Scott, because they quite like the idea of getting some private capital involved in things like that. But I think it's early stages, and I'm not aware of any major investment projects that have yet come across. And as I said, a lot depends on whether the Scottish Government is going to encourage biodiversity and nature restoration as part of their farmland policy. So I think the jury is out on natural capital. That's my view.
Andy.
So the question was whether this bill can tackle some of the issues raised by that whole debate, and the answer is clearly no. I mean, we're at stage one now. No thinking's been done on that. And this is my fundamental point at the beginning. We've had 25 years to build a detailed, strategic, measured programme of land reform that we do every 5 years, and we build and we build and we build. Instead of which we get these sudden little kind of random tactical interventions in the status quo that will achieve nothing. And that gets back to my point that I made to Ms Lennon about having this as a cross-cutting theme in government, like climate is at the moment. So it's a good example of the fact that the government is, the First Minister was in the City of London Corporation at the Mansion House dinner and encouraging people to invest, and there's protocols being developed and finance to be found and all the rest of it, completely oblivious to the impact this will have on land markets, on communities, on opportunities for others and all the rest of it. And completely oblivious to the fact that much of this is wholly speculative. So, no, this bill, I don't think, can do that because we need to do a lot of thinking. And in fact, this evidence session is an example of a lot of thinking that, as I hinted earlier, should have been done in pre-legislative scrutiny. We shouldn't be sitting here arguing about the detail and why something wouldn't work. That's something we should have been doing with the government earlier, so that the bill that comes to you is clear, we know what it's trying to do, we can assess fairly clearly whether it's going to achieve what it's going to do, etc. So my recommendation would be what we need is a programme of land reform that's medium, long term, is fixing the foundations, dealing with the detail and moving forward in a steady, measured way, building on previous ones, instead of this approach of, oh, we better do something on land reform. What can we do? Oh, we'll have a public interest test or whatever. Too random.
I think Rhoda Grant raises a really significant question for the reasons that Magnus Linklater suggested. And again, I'm in broad agreement with Magnus on this, that the natural capital market I am deeply, deeply sceptical about in terms of private investment and the impact it's going to have on the land management in Scotland and the land market in Scotland. I'm also interested that despite all the rhetoric and all the talk about attracting billions of pounds into Scotland to do this, virtually no private finance has been raised at all. And all the things that are being done by the public purse, for the most part, through their normal, conventional ways of investing. So I am deeply sceptical. I think Rhoda Grant raises a really powerful point, though, that the practical impact on communities and places across Scotland from these long-term agreements, up to 100 years that are being sought, some of these agreements, for the use of the land, which is part of the reason that they're not actually happening, because of the length of time that private owners are perhaps rightly sceptical about entering these agreements, as indeed are community owners sceptical about entering these agreements. That it's a huge issue about how you can impact on that. Now, there's part of that becomes a question of regulation about that marketplace and the way in which the forestry scheme and the peatland schemes operate, and how you condition the credits that are earned on the back of that. So it's partly a regulatory answer to that, which I don't think would be for this bill. There's also a lot of work going on in communities and in community organisations talking about the community benefits that should come from any of this investment. In other words, saying you can't just turn up here from a Swiss bank, invest in that estate, a few millions, take all the proceeds out of Scotland effectively thereafter, and leave the community with nothing. And therefore, you're going to have to factor in community benefit. Now, that's part of the Scottish Government's thinking in terms of a recent market framework they published, but it's pretty weak at the present time. And the problem with it is, as soon as you talk about community benefit, you scare off the private investors. So there's a real bind in here. And I think if there's a way in which this can be connected at all with this bill, it's about making sure that land management plans in their creation for these parts of land that we're talking about are talking about how the community benefits out of that, and the engagement process is also talking about how the community can benefit. So there's a marginal way in which you can attach that, but natural capital would require a long inquiry on its own, convener, I suggest.
And I think we tried it as well to get to the bottom of the £20 billion that was being talked about by Nature Scott, and I'm not sure where we got on it, and I'm not sure that I fully understand it, and I'm not sure other people do either. Maybe that's why Far Relay is back on the market with no decision had today. Rhoda, do you have another question?
I've got
Briefly.
a very brief question, and I'd probably get brief answers as well. But we talked a lot about communities and land management plans and how communities engage with them. How do you empower communities to do that? We've heard the cost for landowners, but a lot of the community, the individuals, will be living on that land, will probably be beholden to their landowner at some point. How do they engage properly with those?
So I think we addressed some of this in earlier questioning with Monica Lennon. I would say it's difficult. It's a difficult concept to be able to introduce. The other complicating factor, which I raised in my written evidence, which has not been addressed in the bill, is what do you do with land under crofting tenure or estates, 70% of which are occupied by tenant farmers. And they're people who have substantial control, indeed, within crofting law, almost complete control of the land, and if you want to do something different with it, by and large, they need to be on board. And by and large, crofting communities are not particularly interested in speaking to their landlord because they live hundreds of miles away and really don't have anything to do with the estate except at the margin. So I can't see why crofting communities, for example, would engage with this because of the fact that the landowner essentially doesn't control the land anyway, and there's no account taken of crofters' interest in the bill. So I think there's all sorts of reasons to be concerned about how this is going to happen, which are not addressed. Yep.
Yeah, I think that there's a real challenge for communities to be able to keep up with all this stuff. On the natural capital front, I mean, there is assistance given from the likes of Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We've got a unit that support that. I know that, I don't know much of the detail about this, but I know that Community Land Scotland announced something a couple of weeks ago where they're being funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and others to try and support communities through to navigate their way through the natural capital market and how it impacts them and how they can get a slice of the action, so to speak. But all that's done, in a sense, in a voluntary sense. There's not a statutory way in which communities are regularly supported for this, other than through the likes of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, I'm afraid.
Laurie, do you want to come in on that?
Nothing really to add, no.
Okay, Magnus, do you want to come in briefly?
No.
Okay. Mark, is your question very succinct?
It is, Convener.
Right, go for it.
I've been writing a lot of notes this morning and, you know, thinking about your various suggestions for amendments and ways that the bill could be improved. But I'm left thinking, you know, where are we with this bill now? Because, you know, we've had several hours now of criticism, several hours of proposals for some pretty fundamental changes in the way that the bill is presented. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the bill. Do you think the bill should pass as it is right now? Is it fixable, Peter?
As it stands today,
push you down. A sentence on each from each view would
as it stands today, no. With amendment, yes.
Okay. Do you think the bill is effectively where the crofting bill was in 2005, where the government needs to reflect on this?
The government's got a lot of work to do. What perplexes me, it's not been done already. I don't quite understand how we've got to this point.
Okay. Laurie?
As it's currently drafted, I don't think it should pass, but I think with some fairly significant amendments, it could be worthwhile, although probably still not covering everything it needs to.
Okay, Magnus?
I don't think
any bill.
Hold on. He said Magnus. Andy, you're next. Magnus first.
Sorry. No, I don't think the bill in its present form is workable for all the reasons we've been hearing this morning. I think the government should withdraw it and reconsider it, and reconsider it from a different perspective in terms of land use rather than distribution of land.
Okay, Andy?
Well, I've said in my written evidence that Section 2 to 5, the committee should not recommend Parliament pass them. Now, they are capable, anything's capable of being amended, as Mr Ruskell knows. But the bill is already drafted, and this gets back to my point of having, there should have been more work done pre-legislatively. But I think the fundamental principles behind the lotting and the prior notification and all the rest of it are not going to deliver the outcomes ministers want. So however much you amend that, if you stick with that principle, those mechanisms, it's not going to deliver the outcomes. And on that basis alone, I think it's irresponsible of Parliament to impose new, complex, legalistic, bureaucratic mechanisms on the people of Scotland that are not going to deliver the outcomes they say. I think that's just making bad law.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now, I had some questions which were very niche questions to Andy Whiteman on part 2 of the bill, but as we've all agreed on where we are at this stage about the bill and what should happen to it, I'm going to end it at that point on a note of consensus. So thank you very much to the witnesses for giving your time this morning. Thank you for being succinct on some of the questions and not being so succinct on the others, because I think we've got a fuller understanding. And so I'm now going to suspend the meeting and move into private session. Thank you very much.